The gentleman is recognized.
I thank my friend from Florida, the chairman. I thank him for his support on this legislation. I thank him for his statesmanship on this particular issue, which is critically important for not just our friendship with our ally Israel, but also our own national security and the protection of our own men and women in uniform. Let's be clear about what is happening at the so-called International Criminal Court right now. It has taken unprecedented action of issuing arrest warrants for the sitting prime minister and former minister of defense of our friend and ally Israel. Let that sit in for a minute. This is an entity, the International Criminal Court, that has no jurisdiction over the people of the United States, should have no authority over our people, no authority over the prime minister of Israel. Yet it is extending into the people of Israel's business in defending their interest against violent attack by Hamas, which we define as a terrorist entity, which, as the chairman just pointed out, has killed American citizens and holds American citizens hostage as we sit here today. And somehow it is not a priority for the people of our country that we represent for us to be here on the floor of the House defending our men and women in uniform, defending our citizens, defending our ally Israel and the Prime Minister of Israel from a politicized witch hunt by the International Criminal Court, which again should have and doesn't have any jurisdiction over our people or the people of Israel. I would remind the gentleman from Massachusetts that 42 Democrats voted for this legislation last year. If this is such a crazy piece of legislation, perhaps the gentleman would like to have an inward-facing conference on his side of the aisle. It is very clearly a bipartisan interest to protect our people and the people of our friends in Israel. I would note that our problems aren't just the dangerous terrorist organizations like Hamas, but these international organizations given power over our citizens and our way of life. Not just the International Criminal Court, but, for example, UNRWA and other international organizations, without which Hamas wouldn't have many of the resources it needs to conduct these violent attacks on Israel and our own people. When the gentleman from Massachusetts talks about the plight of the people in Gaza, we should be reminded of the massive piles of pallets of food and relief that are stacked up because the United Nations is too incompetent to move those pallets, and remind our friends of the extent to which Hamas has been taking those resources and not distributing them to the people in Gaza. The fact of the matter here, this legislation is inherently America first. We have had situations where we've had American soldiers and our people targeted by the ICC. It will happen again if the House of Representatives and the Senate and the President don't take action to sanction the ICC to prevent this from happening again in the future. I appreciate the support of the chairman. I appreciate the support of virtually every member of the Republican side of the aisle. I appreciate the support of the 42 Democrats last summer. I look forward to a larger amount of support from Democrats when we vote on this today. I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2025, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 30 minutes.
Thank the Speaker. Today, the President of the United States issued 21 very important pardons of individuals who had been put in jail, prosecuted, persecuted for their religious beliefs and the exercise of their speech. These are individuals who are pro-life, who have been put in jail because a weaponized Department of Justice was unleashed against these individuals, very specifically and purposefully because they were espousing their pro-life views. In the president's action to formally pardon these 21 individuals, he rights a wrong that was carried out against them, but more importantly, sends a loud message that the Department of Justice cannot and should not be targeted toward individuals for their political beliefs and their political actions. But that is precisely what happened to those 21 individuals. How do we know this? Well, if you look at the application of the so-called FACE Act that was used to prosecute these individuals, arrest them and prosecute them, 97% of the FACE Act prosecution between 1994 and 2024 were initiated against pro-life Americans. Now I want you to pause and listen to that again. 97% of the prosecutions under this one act were carried out against pro-life Americans. This despite the fact that there have been numerous attacks on pro-life facilities and crisis pregnancy centers in the wake of Dobbs. 91 pregnancy resource centers have been attacked since the Dobbs opinion was leaked. In 2022, pro-life activist Mark Houck was arrested by the FBI for FACE Act violations related to an incident outside of an abortion facility. They didn't charge him in Pennsylvania, and in fact, they passed. But the feds went after him. Got to ask yourself, why is that true? There have been 411 recorded attacks on Catholic churches since 2020. Was the FACE Act used once by the Department of Justice against any of these Catholic churches? No. And so what does that look like for these 21 individuals? And by the way, I think this is really important in the context of the speeches that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were just giving with respect to the treatment of those individuals incarcerated, charged, prosecuted in the wake of January 6th. And I'll come back to that in a minute. These individuals that I'm talking about with respect to the pro-life prosecutions by the Department of Justice under Joe Biden, while Biden, this is as one of the attorneys for one of the defendants put it, while Biden's prosecutors almost entirely ignored the firebombings and vandalism of hundreds of pro-life churches and pregnancy centers, they viciously pursued pro-life Americans. And had they been opposing anything but abortion, Joe Biden would have given them medals. Instead, Biden wanted them branded as convicted felons and imprisoned for years in a federal penitentiary. Eva Idle, an 89-year-old survivor of a Soviet concentration camp who sat in front of the entrance to an abortion clinic in a wheelchair. She was one of those targeted by the Biden Department of Justice. Let's be clear that she described how she was shipped off in cattle cars to concentration camps in Yugoslavia at age 9. They were packed in body to body with no food, no water. She lived through that. She's 89 years old. Again, I want everybody to understand who's listening to this at home. An 89-year-old survivor of gulags in Europe was prosecuted by the Biden Department of Justice at age 89 for being in a wheelchair in front of an abortion clinic. Federal crime, Federal Department of Justice. Paulette Harlow, 75-year-old grandmother from Kingston, Massachusetts, has 6 children, grandmother to 8. She's suffering from health issues, liver disease, arthritis. She was prosecuted and sentenced to jail in a 25-month sentence in Texas, miles away from her home in Massachusetts. 75 years old. Why? Because she was at an abortion clinic professing her faith and her hope that they would not carry out abortions. Lauren Handy, a peaceful pro-life activist, formally sentenced to 57 months, 5-7, almost 5 years, plus 3 years supervision for efforts to peacefully save the lives of the unborn. Now, I want to be very clear. Lauren, whom I met, is actually a progressive activist. She and I don't agree on a lot of issues. But she was out advocating for life, and she was sentenced by the Biden Department of Justice under Merrick Garland to 57 months in jail. Again, I want everybody to think about that. Protesting an abortion clinic. And nobody here, by the way, is saying that there isn't room for misdemeanor type prosecutions if you're in the way and you won't listen to the, calls for you to leave. Misdemeanor, pay a fine, whatever it might be. Federal prosecution for 57 months. John Hinshaw, 68 years old, sentenced to 21 months. He said, quote, "People are having prayer services all over the place for us. The expression of support has been tremendous." Well, today, the President of the United States righted those wrongs. And he righted those wrongs for those four I just described and 17 others for a total of 21. But he also sent a loud message, as I said before, that the Department of Justice never again should be politicized to target people for their beliefs, to be used as a political weapon, as it has been under the Joe Biden regime. It's a new day, and it's an important day. And in light of, I want to follow up, though, on my colleagues here who took the floor regarding January 6th. I was very clear on the floor here, on this House floor, 4 years ago during January 6th, that what occurred was wrong, that what was occurring, what had occurred was wrong, that those who had broken the law, they should be prosecuted for breaking the law. And I don't know anybody who disagrees with that. I really don't. And there are differing facts for each one of those 1,500 cases, and some of them are pretty bad facts, and some of them, there are absolutely no facts at all, but they were pursued anyway, and therein lies the problem. And I want everybody to really listen to this point. There's going to be time for us to study all 1,500 cases, and we can look and we can judge what was the nature of how they were arrested, where they were arrested, where were they put in jail, how long were they in jail, what were the conditions in the jail, how many of their loved ones could they talk to, what was their access to defense counsel, what was the nature of the prosecution, what did the judges do, what were the sentences. We need to look at all those things. Notably, the president commuted, I think, 14 individual sentences. Don't have it right in front of me, but I think it was 14. Which tells me that the president and his team went through and tried to differentiate some of the worst egregious acts in their view that shouldn't be pardoned, but rather commuted to time served. But I would also note this: we are now 48 months beyond the events. Many of these individuals were arrested early in the process, have been in jail, have been in the judicial system, and have been dragged along. I've talked to dozens of the parents, family members, wives, husbands, spouses of the people that were jailed, unable to talk to their loved ones, people without criminal records, people who had done nothing else. Many of these people were charged with just parading here in the Capitol complex, which then the court said, well, not sure about that, and then crossing a line and being a place where you're not supposed to be, the obstruction issues. Well, what were you obstructing exactly? Now, again, I think it is important to note that what occurred that day should not have occurred, that many of the acts that occurred should have been punished. Some that were punished should have been punished. But when you completely ignore the rule of law, when you politically charge people, when you use the Department of Justice as a political weapon, you undermine the rule of law and you turn it on its head so that there's no differentiation between the right and the wrong. When you literally go prosecute an 89-year-old gulag survivor because she was exercising her pro-life views at an abortion clinic, what do you think one's view is of the righteousness of the other actions of the Department of Justice? How do you look at the 1,500 and go through and break them down in a way when 48 months later, as a father was on a news show today talking about his son, saying that his son had been moved from jail to jail, had to filter the water through a sock because there was so much rust in the water, that they weren't able to talk to him for 3 weeks over Christmas, didn't even know where he was, couldn't get access to counsel during a lot of those times. What are we supposed to do with that? Ignore it? The president came in and made a judgment that these 1,500 people of varying forms, some sentenced, some not, some had taken plea deals, some not, had 48 months of their life turned upside down by a Department of Justice who wanted to try to make an example out of them, and the President of the United States said enough. And you know what? I agree. Because at the end of the day, 48 months later, many of them having been in jail for all or a lot of that time, many of them who had their doors broken down, many of them had FBI raids. I had 2 grandmas driving from Austin, Texas, out into the hill country just a few months ago who were arrested and jailed overnight because they were physically present here at the Capitol. Not even inside, to the best of my knowledge. I think they might have just crossed one of the bike lines. 3 years later, you arrest 2 grandmothers, put them in jail? Does anybody see what happens when you politicize the justice system? The scales of justice become something that you can't look at as blindfolded? And again, why am I talking about this? Because today, the president righted the wrongs of those 21 individuals who were literally protesting in their view, and I share that view, the murdering of the unborn children. I think that stuff matters. I think it matters a lot. Because had Joe Biden, had Merrick Garland not politicized the Department of Justice, then maybe 20 or 30 cases of individuals who had done something that were particularly egregious, that were prosecuted, maybe those wouldn't have been pardoned. I don't know. I haven't studied every case. But when you're looking at 1,500 cases and all the people who are being abused, I think the president did the right thing. And again, differentiated between those with the commuted sentences. But meanwhile, what the president is doing, besides, I think, trying to restore balance to the justice system, is he's keeping his promises to secure our country. One of my colleagues over there said the first thing the president did was make us less safe. Are you serious? Are you serious? You think reversing politicized political prosecutions 4 years later is making us less safe? May I remind my Democrat colleagues that the individual who burned down a police station, a career criminal, got 27 months. That's the idea of justice, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Let's put aside the $2 billion of damage nationwide in the wake of the Floyd riots. Let's put aside all the other damage that flowed from that. Meanwhile, what is the president doing? Making our nation much more safe. Executive order declaring a national emergency at the border. In the first Congress that I was in office, I introduced the Border Visibility and Security Act to help regain operational control of the border. I put together a bill calling on the designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And I'm pleased that that was one of the president's executive orders this week, declaring cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. He issued an executive order requiring Homeland Security to deport aliens with orders of removal. There's over 1 million with orders of removal that Joe Biden wouldn't do. Again, the lawlessness of the previous administration set the stage for the dangers that we've experienced as people, and now the president, President Trump, is undoing that damage. An executive order to end categorical parole policies, undoing the CBP-1 app that was used to flood the zone with people who came into our country, were released, and did things like kill Jocelyn Nungray, whose mother, Alexis, I've gotten to know and who was with me for the inauguration this weekend. An executive order to end the catch and release program, and an executive order to resume the successful migrant protection protocols and return to Mexico so we can stop the flow, to reinstate recognition of Title 42 where you're traveling through country with communicable diseases, an executive order ending birthright citizenship as it has been applied wrongly and incorrectly for years to people who have manufactured or have used a manufactured cottage industry in which people pay money to get delivered to the country, have a baby, get the citizenship, and then it is what is known as anchor babies. And it is real, and it is pervasive, and it is problematic, and it turns our country's system on its head. And by the way, yes, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to say, yeah, court today ruled, that is not constitutional, so they put an injunction on it. Well, we'll see. We'll see how this plays out in the legal system. But from my reading of the law, when the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, a mere 4 years later, the United States Supreme Court in the slaughterhouse cases explicitly said, 4 years removed from the passage of an amendment to the United States Constitution, the then sitting Supreme Court said that it did not apply to people who were here as the children that were being born here of people that were foreign citizens. Another court echoed that a decade or so later. One court came in and said, well, no, we think there's birthright citizenship if you're born here to a foreign national, but only if you're a legal permanent resident. I believe the president's executive order is correct. I believe it is lawful. I believe it is constitutional. I believe he ought to continue to enforce it, and we ought to be challenging this all the way up through the courts and immediately win this. And I believe this Supreme Court will side on the right side, which is that you are a citizen if you are the child of an American citizen. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof has to matter. The president is restoring our border, restoring law and order, reversing the damage, and he should be. And he should be thanked and congratulated for it. But what else has he been doing in the last, what am I adding up, 78 hours? 78 hours in. Withdrawing us from the disastrous World Health Organization, a globalist entity that has been undermining our sovereignty and wants to take away our own decision-making and make us subject to foreign powers on our health issues. Withdrawing us from the disastrous Paris Climate Treaty, making us beholden to China and foreign nationals and unable to advance and promote our own American energy. By the way, had we not reversed all of that, we wouldn't have been adding fuel to the fire of Russia going into Ukraine, so to speak. Declaring a national energy emergency, unleashing American energy and opening up exploration, reversing Biden's ridiculous bans on offshore drilling, making it the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female, ending affirmative action and DEI in the federal government, trying to get us back to the actual view of a government that does not look through the lens of color or sex, but rather merit and hard work, requiring everybody to actually show up to work. Who knew? All of those things are things that the president is doing in a matter of 78 hours since getting sworn in a few feet from this chamber, pointing the wrong direction, a few feet from this chamber, and making our country immensely better off for it. We've already seen a massive decline in the number of people trying to come across our border. Who knew? Who could have predicted that if you enforce the law, maybe people will say, I guess we can't come now. Maybe the cartels will say, this may not be the profit center that we have at the moment. Just last night, a guy was apprehended by ICE, like somewhere up in New York or somewhere in the Northeast, and he lost his mind. He started swearing at Trump, F Trump, all this stuff. I'm with Biden forever. I'm not going back to Haiti, he said. Yeah, you are. You are. And so are a lot of other people. Because the prisons of the world shouldn't be dumped onto the streets of America, endangering our citizens. And that is what Biden did, and that is what Trump is reversing. But now we've got to deliver. And this is my message to my colleagues here. We have to deliver. My friends in the Freedom Caucus, other conservatives, we have put forward a plan that we believe would deliver, and deliver quickly. We don't have time to waste. The president needs resources. Tom Homan needs resources. The Border Patrol met with the union this last week. They need resources. ICE needs resources to do their job. So let's do it. They want $86 billion. Let's find it. We can. The defense needs to be modernized, built up after getting undermined and focused on all sorts of ridiculous woke and DEI policies. We need a new, modern, robust military to beat China. We can do that. We've put forward $200 billion over 4 years under President Trump to modernize the military, an additional $50 billion a year. Let's do it. We can do it and we can pay for it. We said we would raise the debt ceiling, 2 years, about $4 trillion. We're not inclined to want to raise the debt ceiling, if you haven't noticed, but we'll do it. The president wants us to get that aside so Chuck Schumer can't play games with the bond market. So let's get rid of the debt, or let's increase the debt ceiling. Let's get $86 billion for border. Let's get $200 billion for defense. And then let's apply a handful of cuts to pay for those things. Let us, I don't know, how about repeal the student loan fiasco? It's $100 to $270 billion. How about let's just apply Medicaid work requirements so that if you're on Medicaid, for able-bodied Americans, not all, but the able-bodied Americans, that they must work. Pretty popular issue. Every Republican's voted for it. $120 billion. So we can pay for defense, pay for border, make our Medicaid system better, reverse the ridiculous student loan bailouts, which are giving money from one American to another. The plumber who never went to college is subsidizing the sociology major sitting in their parents' basement, tweeting about nonsense. How about we end that? You pay your student loans. You took the loans out. Plumber, you didn't. Go do your thing. Every American that I know that works hard agrees with that. We can do that. Conservatives, the Freedom Caucus, have put that forward. We want to support President Trump. We want to make sure that President Trump can deliver on the border, get the debt ceiling away from being used politically by Chuck Schumer. And so we put that plan forward. I think we should have already done it. But as usual, we sit in this body and we debate. And we continue to debate. And unfortunately, we're still debating. And unfortunately, in my opinion, we're going to continue to debate. Because there is a real debate going on about taxing and spending. And I'm blowing Republicans' minds when I say, I'm all for tax cuts, but you better cut the spending so that we can actually reduce deficits. So I've been pretty clear about that. A lot of my colleagues have been pretty clear about that. Some of my colleagues here seem to want nothing but tax cuts and no spending cuts. But I'll also hear a lot of my colleagues say, oh yeah, I'm for the spending cuts. I say, okay, well, how many? How much? Well, I mean, as many as we can get. Okay. Are we going to reduce deficits or not? I mean, that's the question I'm going to be asking everybody. Can you do math? And are we going to reduce deficits? That's the question every American sent us here to do. Do the hard work. Sit at the table. Why don't we put the microphones down, put the cameras away, use these tables, roll our sleeves up, get the paper out, and do the math. Yes, tax cuts can and do produce economic growth, more money in the hands of the people. Yes, it is morally correct to leave more money in the hands of the American people. I would gladly vote to get rid of the income tax. Zero it out. Leave the money in the hands of the people. But guess what? Whether it's President Trump's vision or views on tariffs, whether it's something else, there has to be some amount of revenue to pay for all of the promises and all of the programs that every politician loves to go home and run on. So now the rubber meets the road, or the piper needs to be paid, or whatever metaphor you want to use. We cannot have our cake and eat it too. You can't run around and beat up the CBO and blame the CBO and say, they never score anything right. Well, you know what? You're probably correct. They're human beings. And maybe they're biased. Fine. Okay. You think they're biased? Great. Come in with your models. Come in with somebody else's models and show me how the math is going to work out that if we do all of these tax cuts and do no spending cuts, that somehow we're magically going to have deficits going down. Because it's just not going to be true in the aggregate. When Ronald Reagan cut taxes in 1981 from the confiscatory top rate of 70% under Jimmy Carter to 28% on the top marginal rate, yeah, there was a lot of good economic growth. When we cut corporate rates 8 years ago from 35% to 21%, and corporations aren't these blobs, they're people. When we cut the corporate rates, yeah, there was pretty significant economic growth. That was pretty meaningful. Trying to keep more capital here. Expensing, research and development, all these things create growth. But a lot of tax cuts don't. Take the child tax credits. I get how child tax credits can be argued to be good policy, pro-family policy, good for hardworking families that have kids. There are a lot of arguments for child tax credits. But they're not going to be massively stimulative. They cost about $800 billion over 10 years. So my point is over here is like, what are you cutting? What are we cutting? Because we can't continue to rack up deficits. And I think I'm running close on time, and I just want to close with this. We right now have 36 point whatever trillion dollars in debt. Right now we are racking up about 1.8 to $2 trillion a year in deficits. When the interest on the bonds that we currently hold are getting refinanced over the next couple of years, those interest payments are going to go up. Probably to the tune of another $200 to $300 billion a year. If we renew all of the tax cuts, which I support, but we don't offer any cuts correspondingly, we will add hundreds of billions, if not several trillion dollars of deficit spending. So the job for us, Republicans and Democrats, is to not do that. And I'm asking for deficit neutrality on the tax bill. Let me just be clear. If I win that fight, if all my colleagues who want deficit neutrality or deficit reduction on the tax bill combined with spending cuts being debated in reconciliation right now, if I win that fight that I'm having right now with colleagues, you're like, oh, I don't know. The best we'll get is the current deficit. That's how we would end up with exactly what we have right now of roughly $2 trillion deficits. By the way, it'll get worse because of the interest I told you about. As we keep refinancing our debt, and interest goes up. So what I'm trying to scrap for in this body is just trying not to make it worse. It's like Christmas Vacation. Worse? How can it get any worse? I'll tell you how it can get worse. Vote for more deficits. So we shouldn't do that. And my actual last point, with I think a minute and a half remaining, is that if we're going to do anything at all in reconciliation on policy, we should be fighting for healthcare freedom. My office put out a report 2 days ago called The Case for Healthcare Freedom. It's 48 pages that outlines all of the ways in which we are destroying the average American's access to healthcare, that we need to restore the doctor-patient relationship, that we need to break down the stranglehold that insurance companies and hospitals and pharma have on our healthcare, free them up with expansive health savings accounts, allow them to decouple that so they can go out in the market and get actual insurance, go to direct primary care, and actually get care for themselves instead of paying $25,000 a year between their employer and themselves to be able to go to an insurance company and be told that they can't get care. So if we want to transform this country, reduce the deficits, give the president what he needs to secure the border, and give us health care freedom. And that's my call to my colleagues. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act protects one of our most vulnerable populations, innocent children. I am proud that at the beginning of the 119th Congress, we are taking this step toward protecting life and the fundamental rights of our most vulnerable American citizens. We are all too familiar with the horrors of abortion and the unchecked power of the abortion industry. We know it is simply common sense to provide life-saving care to those babies who survive an abortion. In 2013, Jill Stanek testified before the House Judiciary Committee, seeing the horrific realities of being a nurse and seeing children being aborted, alive, and left to die alone in a dirty utility closet. I can hardly believe that those words are coming out of my mouth sitting here on the floor of the House of Representatives in this, the beacon of hope for people around the world. She said, "I was traumatized and changed forever by my experience of holding a little abortion survivor for 45 minutes until he died. A 21 or 22-week-old baby who had been aborted because he had Down syndrome." Hard to believe. One of my guests for the inauguration, one of my dear friends in Austin, Texas, a somewhat well-renowned musician and songwriter, brought his son who has Down syndrome and is such a blessing to this world. That child, as well as this child that was left to die alone in a dirty utility closet, was and is a fellow human being, a fellow American, whose right to life should have been protected by the law. Congress cannot stand by and allow this type of suffering. We have both a moral and a constitutional duty here. This legislation is simple. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act requires that infants born alive under an attempted abortion receive the same protection under the law and degree of care of any newborn, combined with, by the way, the penalties associated with those who would ignore their duty under the law. Mr. Speaker, it's a common sense measure. Unfortunately, as evidenced by comments from many of my Democrat colleagues, not everyone believes that a child born alive should be protected. In 2019, then Virginia Governor Northam stated, and I quote, "The infant would be delivered, the infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother." The Democrat governor of Virginia. This blatant disregard for human life has no place in the medical profession in our country. Last Congress, unfortunately, only one Democrat voted in favor of the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, and another voted present. My Democrat colleagues sent a clear message to the American people that these innocent lives are not worthy of protection, and those who intentionally let infants die after birth should not be held accountable. If a baby American, a fellow American, is lying on a table, dying, and we cannot, as Congress, as the leaders of this country, the leaders of the free world, cannot say that under the language of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, under the language of the Declaration of Independence that animates our Constitution, under the privileges and immunities, the roots of which are found in English common law, that create the bedrock of our entire justice system, then we need to make sure that that child is protected, even and especially because of its defenseless nature. That is our duty. That is why I rise in support of this legislation. That is why I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady. So here we are again, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who constantly always talk about the need to support a CR to, quote, keep the lights on, now find themselves in the curious position of not wanting to have the lights on because they don't like what's happening. So they don't want the lights to be on because you've got people in the executive branch who have taken seriously the election mandate that was given to the President of the United States to end the absurdity of nonstop wasteful spending, the ridiculousness of expenditures like $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. Like, that's the kind of stuff that make the American people's head explode. And there are dozens, hundreds of these examples. I could sit here and list. And the fact is, this stuff is getting exposed in real time. The American people are seeing it. And now my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are trying to run from it. That's why they don't like this bill. That's why they want to have a shutdown after all of these years of decrying the possibility of shutdown. You're seeing all of the news today talking about the possibility of a Schumer shutdown. You're talking about there's news article after news article. The Hill, February 11th, Democrats step up talk about using shutdown as leverage against Donald Trump. Democrat senators who request anonymity said that March 14th deadline may be the best leverage they have. Democrats in Congress see potential shutdown as leverage to counter Trump. U.S. Congress, The Guardian, February 15th. I could insert into the record dozens of these stories because the fact of the matter is the gig is up. Much like the American people were able to see the absolute and rampant corruption in our education system during COVID, when everything was shut down and they were watching their kids and they saw these screens and they said, what on earth are they being taught? And suddenly the American people saw the reality of our broken education system. They saw the fraud that was perpetrated by Anthony Fauci on the American people and shutting down their way of life. And now you've got Democrats who are now being exposed for having continuously funded this largesse and this bureaucracy that is completely indefensible. The American people are tired of having their tax dollars taken and dollars being borrowed by an endless stream of borrowing by this Congress. And now you've got a Congress that is willing to work with the president to stop it, to stand up and say enough. And what are we putting in place? Oh, the horror, a spending freeze? Oh, can you believe it, that the federal government might need to tighten its belt and have a spending freeze? And then my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to bring out these parade of horribles, and somehow that is a massive number of cuts, because only in Washington is that a cut. When you've got a spending freeze and holding basically spending in check from 2024, and we have a bill that, by the way, pulls out earmarks, which are often replete with special wish lists. By the way, that's both sides of the aisle. And we've got a bill here that is going to hold spending in check to allow us to do our job for the fiscal year 26 appropriation cycle between now and September. By the way, it was Republicans who passed 5 appropriations bills off of the House floor last year and 12 appropriations bills out of committee last year. The previous year, it was Republicans who passed 7 off the floor and all 12 out of committee. The Democrat-led Senate passed 0. You want to know why we are where we are right now? It's because our Democratic colleagues in the Senate passed 0 appropriations bills, not 1. So we came in here. Now Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. And now we're trying to get things moving in the right direction. And our Democrat colleagues don't want to have any part of it. So we're putting forward a common sense measure that, look, I understand why some of my conservative flank fiscal conservatives have concerns about a CR. I don't love CRs. But when you can have a CR that extends spending at 2024 levels for the next 6 months and empowers the president to be able to continue to do what they're doing, shining the light on spending restraint, shining the light on waste so that we can do our job and implement that. And by the way, I'll say that to both sides of the aisle. Both sides of the aisle need to take in that information and implement it when we do appropriations this year. Move spending down, eliminate the waste, try to do something about the fact that in 2019, our entire budget was $4.5 trillion. Today, it is $7 trillion. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have no answer to that besides, magic tax cuts. You could literally confiscate the wealth of the wealthiest 1% of America and not dent what we've got in terms of $36 trillion in debt, when you would kill jobs and destroy the economy in the process. But that's the only answer my colleagues have to $7 trillion in spending. The fact of the matter is this CR is responsible. It's fiscally appropriate. It'll leave the lights on so that the president and Doge and Elon and Russ Voter and OMB can do their job. And I hope that my colleagues on this side of the aisle will support the rule. I yield back.
Gentlelady.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma. My, how times have changed. How many times have we been sitting on the floor of the House listening to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle saying, a CR is the greatest thing since sliced bread. We must have the CR. Because when some of us were saying, wait a minute, Mr. President, wait a minute, President Biden, maybe we should actually secure the border of the United States instead of letting millions of people flood in and kill Americans and let fentanyl flow into our communities. So when we wanted to secure the border and we dared to say that the funding should actually reflect that, and we threatened to, hey, maybe we should actually have a fight on spending, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said, CR, we got to have a CR, our precious CR. Well, here we are. And what are we doing? Our colleagues oppose the CR. Why? Because we would have spending frozen for 6 months, down about $7 billion, but importantly, allow DOGE and allow our friends in the administration to continue to expose the absurdity of federal spending. How about $1.5 million to advance diversity, equity, inclusion in Serbia's workplaces? $70,000 for production of a DEI musical in Ireland. $2.5 million for electric vehicles in Vietnam. $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. This is what our Democratic colleagues are fighting for, to continue to fund absurd programs rather than do the common sense work of what we're trying to do, to have more beds for ICE, secure the border of the United States, ensure that our defense is funded, ensure that we're able to hold spending in check so we can actually have a chance of saving this great country. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize my friend from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 4 minutes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank my friend from Virginia. I would note for the American people that this week the Republican majority is bringing before the body 2 important measures. One, to ensure the integrity of our elections, to ensure that only American citizens can vote in American elections, a fairly common sense principle which enjoys 80% plus approval among the American people, that would straightforward ensure that non-citizens may not vote in our elections. It's that simple. The second measure we're bringing forward is a piece of legislation that we're actively debating right now in a committee that I'm co-chairing, the Judiciary Committee, and I will go back to that committee forthwith, in which we are having witnesses before the Judiciary Committee discussing the extent to which we have judges that are taking action unilaterally, what are called temporary restraining orders or injunctions, to thwart the efforts of the administration's actions in direct result of the election in November, to carry out the agenda for which the president was elected. Now, this is a bipartisan problem that has been something where you have judges that will act unilaterally as a single district judge, and the question is, what do we do about it? We've had Democrats that have said we should change it. We have Republicans that said we should change it. Well, we're trying to change it. We're trying to say that a judge can take action on the parties before them, but nothing more, and then have that go up through another procedure, and then allow the of an appellate panel or a 3-judge panel or the Supreme Court fast tracks, they decide there should be an injunction, there can be. So let me put this in plain speak for the American people. We're putting measures on the floor to ensure that only American citizens vote in American elections, and to ensure that judges don't make the policy for America, that the elected leaders do, whether it's the executive branch president or the members of Congress, and that there would be a process to ensure that the Constitution, the laws of the land are being protected. That's what this majority body is putting forward. And we can listen all day long about what we're hearing today regarding proxy voting. The American people that I know and represent and talk to expect us to show up. Right now across this country, Americans are showing up to work. They're going in and they're doing their plumbing work. They're electricians showing up to work. They're builders. They're standing out in the sun. They're picking crops. They're working hard. They don't get to take a pass. They don't get to not show up. But we were elected to represent 750,000 Americans each. We are elected under the Constitution of the United States, and we are supposed to show up in Congress. It's what it means. We're supposed to be here. It's why the institution exists. It's why this floor exists. And there have been countless reasons why there would be cause for us to want to allow members to have some sort of flexibility. People who are sick, our friend Steve Scalise, who was shot. He was shot, and he didn't ask for some special dispensation. He fought cancer, is still fighting cancer, and as the majority leader is standing here on this floor every day doing the job. New dads. I'm a dad. My daughter, my son, they asked me to show up to things. I missed my son's 4-H presentation last week. I missed my daughter's 4-H this last week. I've missed countless family engagements. My wife carries the burden of making sure our family can function back home in Texas. But you know what? I signed up for the job. That's what I did. I signed up for the job. And when you let this happen, it will not just happen for mothers or fathers. It will be for everybody. And then we'll have proxy voting where you will have pressures brought to bear that will fundamentally change this institution. No, we should not allow this to occur. No, we shouldn't have discharge petition brought to the floor, which does violence to the Constitution, does violence to the body, and does it with no ability to amend it, because the way the rule was drafted, there would be no amendments, no ability to debate it. We should stand.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
I
Gentleman's
appreciate my
recognized.
friend from Virginia. What we are doing on the floor today is right and proper under our rules. It is to say that we should have a full-throated debate on something that would fundamentally change the people's house. Nothing more, nothing less. And we should do that. This is something that's been debatable. It was debated by the founders. It was debated by them and rejected. It was debated and rejected in the Articles of Confederation. It was debated and rejected in the Constitution. And now we are staring at the result of having set aside tradition and precedent by embracing proxy voting during COVID. Now it's being trying to be expanded beyond that. We should not do that. And with that, I will yield back.
Gentleman
I thank the gentlelady from North Carolina and the chairman of the Rules Committee and my friend. Talking about rigging the rules, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are all too happy to have district judges rig the rules to stop the President of the United States from being able to defend our country. Just last week, within close proximity to my house in Dripping Springs, Texas, 47 individuals who are affiliated with the gang Tren de Aragua were found by ICE right down the road in suburban Austin, Texas. 47 people, including 9 children, what was a stash house, moving narcotics through it. The same gang that killed Jocelyn Dungray last summer, the same gang that was torturing and driving fear into the hearts of the people in Aurora, Colorado, in the apartment complexes that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to acknowledge. These are all the same people that are being allowed to vote, the same people that we were elected in November to remove from the country. And the President of the United States is commander-in-chief and defending the United States, and as the chief executive is carrying out the laws to remove dangerous individuals from the United States of America. And then an activist district judge in the District of Columbia decided, in his view, he had to step in. He had to step in and try to assert his jurisdiction where it did not belong, to try to stop the President of the United States from removing dangerous gang members that are killing Americans. Now, what happened yesterday? The United States Supreme Court said, whoa, whoa, whoa. You don't get to do that, Mr. District Judge in D.C. If you're going to do this, you have to do this in Texas. Well, that was the whole point. Just today, we had another ruling out of the Supreme Court slapping down yet another activist judge. Now, what are we doing? The gentleman from Massachusetts asked, what are we doing as Republicans? We're putting forward language today that would stop rogue district judges from carrying out nationwide injunctions and temporary restraining orders that are trying to effectively legislate from the bench. Now, we're not alone in that position. The Biden administration's Solicitor General in 2024 told the Supreme Court, Court of Equity may grant relief only to the parties before it. In 2022, that same Solicitor General asked the Supreme Court to address nationwide injunctions. Justice Elena Kagan in 2022 spoke out against the ability of a single judge to stop implementation of a policy across the country. Well, lo and behold, we're advancing bipartisan work to address a bipartisan problem that Democrats have very clearly identified. And the only difference now is that Donald Trump is in the White House instead of Joe Biden. Would the gentlelady yield me an additional minute?
I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
I thank the gentlelady from North Carolina. So again, Republicans have brought forward in a bill that addresses a problem that Democrats have identified as a problem, to say that the parties before the court are the only ones to whom that it should apply, allows for a mechanism to achieve nationwide injunctions through a 3-judge panel. Now, what else are we bringing to the floor? A bill that will say that only American citizens should vote in American elections. Oh, the controversy. Oh, my gosh. Oh, the bloodletting. That we might say in the United States House of Representatives that only American citizens should be able to vote in American elections. But that's what we're doing. Republicans are responding to an American people who are tired of the previous administration that was allowing illegals to come into our country, kill our citizens, vote in our elections, undermine our country. And we are addressing their concerns, and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to address it. I stand in support of the rule, and I thank the gentlelady from North Carolina.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend from Texas. I appreciate the able job that he has done in ushering through a responsible budget on the House side of the Capitol. Unfortunately, we're here debating an irresponsible budget sent over to us from the Senate. But I first, before my colleagues on the other side of the aisle applaud me for my opposition to the Senate bill, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to acknowledge any program that they don't think they can just continue to shovel money out, despite the fact it has terrible outcomes. Medicaid is debilitating the vulnerable, not helping them. We are shoveling money out to the able-bodied on the back of expansion of Obamacare. We are crippling the very program they say they want to uphold, while we allow money laundering to California, which they brag about openly, to give money to those who are here illegally and to destroy the program with an FMAP rate that is higher than the vulnerable, giving out more money than we even give to Medicare. But to my friends on this side of the aisle, when are we going to get serious about spending? The House budget actually does a job of trying to get to budget neutrality, balancing tax policy and spending policy. The Senate sent over a joke, and we're going to capitulate to the Senate, knowing full well that the Senate instructions carry the day. And we're going to be sitting there in a reconciliation debate where we're going to end up on the short end of the stick, but worse, the American people are going to end up on the short end of the stick because it absolutely increases deficits. No one can deny it. Anyone wants to get in a room and come debate me with a whiteboard, show me the math. At some point, if you're in Congress, pass a math test, because the Senate bill doesn't add up. It will destroy this country with more deficits and the inflation tax that is crippling the average American family. I will not vote for the Senate bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Well done, Chip. Well done.
Thank the Speaker. I want to thank the Chairman for his strong work and commitment to election integrity and to working with us on this bill, in particular, the SAVE Act. He's done an extraordinary job, and I'm proud to work with him and work with the rest of my colleagues on it. I'm proud to work with my friend Cleta Mitchell, who had a significant hand in what we were doing here. I'm quite certain that she is pretty well aware of protecting the right of females to be able to vote, along with my friends Stephanie Bice and Mary Miller and Laurel Lee, Lauren Boebert, and Kat Kamak, all of whom came down to the floor in full support of this legislation, because they know the truth. They know the truth that the American people know, which is that as much as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to bring up the DMV, the American people know that the DMV is very good at giving driver's license to illegal aliens, because we know it to be true. We know that there are people who have been indicted for voting illegally. We know that there are voter rolls with massive numbers of people who are illegally present in the United States. We know that the previous administration let in millions of people into the United States, wrongfully and illegally under parole and asylum, blatantly abusing the law to put people in the United States that have no basis for being here, many of whom carried out dangerous acts against American people, killed American citizens, but importantly, have been registering to vote. That's what's been happening. So what we understand is the American people have spoken very clearly that they believe only American citizens should vote in American elections. There's nothing controversial about that. There's nothing controversial about saying that you should be able to ensure that only citizens vote. And let's be very clear. Federal law has currently been interpreted to prohibit states from being able to check citizenship. That's the truth. That's why the state of Arizona, for example, has two systems, one for state and local, one for federal.
When he speaks, the gentleman's continued to
The good people of Arizona have two systems in place. They check for citizenship for state and local elections, and they're unable to check for citizenship in federal elections. The point of this bill is to ensure that we guarantee only citizens vote by allowing those states to be able to check, by having systems, federal systems, be open to the states to be able to check, and to require proof of citizenship when you register. There's nothing complex about that. There's nothing more sacred under the Constitution than ensuring that the people are able to have the voice in the election of the people that represent them in Washington and throughout the country. Once that is undermined, then people lose faith in the very institutions upon which this is built. This legislation is designed to restore that faith, to save our elections, to save election integrity. I'm proud to have worked on this bill with my friend, the chairman, with my colleagues on this side of the aisle, and I would note that 5 of my Democrat colleagues joined us last summer to vote for this bill. Hardly a partisan exercise. Hardly a partisan exercise to say that we should protect the elections of the American people. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, to restore confidence and faith in our elections, to take a step forward in ensuring that people know that citizens will be in control of this republic as the founders intended. And I yield back. On the legislation that is before us, I know that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are no doubt about to launch into how we've had an ineffective first 100 days and Congress is not doing anything. Well, let me put in perspective for the American people what we're focusing on. We're focusing on undoing the damage of the last 4 years of the Biden administration. The president is doing that on a daily basis in the White House today. And then we in Congress are using the powers that we have before us in a obvious narrow majority and in a narrow majority in the Senate, where you have to get through things through the Senate with 60 votes. We're using the tools in front of us to try to limit and minimize the damage caused by the previous administration and, frankly, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle today. Notably, we're talking about, in this situation, what we have done so far. We have passed legislation to secure our elections, H.R. 22, the SAVE Act, to guarantee that only citizens vote, American citizens vote in American elections, to hold rogue judges accountable for issuing nationwide injunctions and try to change the process, which, by the way, is not partisan. Elena Kagan talked about the need for injunction relief. The Democrat Solicitor General under the previous administration talked about the need for injunction reform. And so we offer legislation that would change and reform injunctions. We passed that before Easter so that you can't have a single judge legislating and making national policy by temporary restraining order injunction. We made changes on border policy with the Lake and Riley Act, which is extremely important, and legislation to combat the flow of fentanyl. But importantly, what we've been trying to do is undo the damage on the border. Now, keep in mind what has happened now over the first 100 days. In just 100 days, Southwest border apprehensions have decreased by 94% year over year. Now, I want everybody to consider that for a second. 94%. Now, what changed? Have we passed a massive law? Have we enacted the law that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle last year said was necessary, this bipartisan bill, which, by the way, would have codified all of the bad policies under the Biden administration? No, the only thing that changed was a White House willing to enforce the law. That's it, literally. And now you have a 94% reduction in the apprehensions at the border, 94% reduction. And keep in mind, we are now at levels of somewhere around 100 to 200 a day, 3,000 to 6,000 a month. We had 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 a day apprehensions under the Biden administration. The president has restored common sense, ending DEI in the military and working to keep men from competing in women's sports, affirming that there are 2 genders. These are common sense. You wouldn't think we'd have to spend time on the floor of the House of Representatives doing those things or having the president do it by executive order, but here we are. Energy, the president has unlocked Americans' energy potential, or at least taken a giant step to do so. Reopening 625 million acres for drilling, withdrawing from the disastrous Paris Climate Agreement, approving new LNG projects. And here before us today, we have what we call CRAs under the Congressional Review Act. And the purpose of these is to undo burdensome Biden regulations. This is our ability and our prerogative to hold the Biden administration accountable, and that doesn't stop just because the Democrats lost an election and we have a Republican in the White House. We have a duty to undo some of that damage. Under these bills, we would repeal California's Advanced Clean Trucks waiver, which currently would allow the state to mandate the sale of zero-emission trucks. Mandate the sale of zero-emission trucks. Repeal the California's Advanced Clean Cars waiver, allowing the state to ban the sale of gas-powered vehicles by 2035. Put an end to California's implementation of its most recent nitrogen oxide engine emission standards, which create burdensome and unworkable standards for heavy-duty on-road engines. Nullify a rule by the national parks that would infringe on the employment of a recreational area, contravening the agency's own mandate when it was created. And finally, one that will end an Endangered Species Act designation by the Fish and Wildlife Service that would threaten water resources and other conservation efforts. Now, these things matter to the average American. My colleagues are going to say, oh, this is small ball. It doesn't matter. Every one of these regulations add up to interference with the enjoyment of life by the American people, drive up the price of the goods and services for the average hardworking American family, make vehicles more expensive, make our lives more costly, and then you wonder why you're suffering from inflation and you're suffering from the inability to afford to live in the modern world. So this Congress is taking steps to undo that damage, working with the White House to restore the ability of the average American family to live and afford the basic necessities of life, including vehicles and the right to be able to choose in an open market the vehicle of their choice. Now, again, I know my colleagues are going to say, well, we're infringing on California. But let's remember that California gets treated specially and uniquely, and that then has a domino effect through the rest of the country. And that is unique to California, based on past precedents involving Los Angeles smog and other things, where that is causing a direct impact on other states across the country. So with that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlemen.
I'm always amazed when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle ignore the fact that these EVs require power. Somehow they get charged from the magic fairy dust of the magic energy tree. I mean, what are we talking about here? How do you power up an electric vehicle? Burning coal? Burning gas? The nuclear plants that we're not actually permitting or building in the United States? While China builds 2 coal-fired plants virtually every week, we're building none. Well, good for us. But the vast majority of the world is producing power with coal, natural gas, and it is growing exponentially. Meanwhile, we are crushing our grid, the reliability of American power, making it more expensive for the average American, and doing really nothing about worldwide CO2 production. That's the truth. China and India are pumping it out. And meanwhile, my colleagues love to ignore the slave labor in China to produce the batteries that they drive around in their EVs while they pat themselves on the back and go to cocktail parties talking about how fantastic it is that they drive their EVs and how enlightened they are. I'd introduce 3 articles into the record. Like slave and master, DRC miners toil for pennies an hour to fuel electric cars. In The Guardian, EV makers' use of Chinese suppliers raise concerns about forced labor. U.S. says Chinese lithium-ion batteries are made with child labor as trade war spills into EVs. The fact of the matter is, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to parade around EV mandates like they're somehow going to magically create power out of thin air, ignoring the fact we're empowering China, ignore the fact we're empowering Chinese labor or child laborers, while we destroy the cost of living for the average American family, take away choice, take away the ability of an American citizen to be able to go out into the market and buy a hybrid vehicle or another vehicle that they can use to travel long distances, do their job, whether they're a plumber, whether they're an electrician, whether they're carrying goods and services in a truck. And then they wonder why the cost of goods and services go up. And then they want to blame tariffs when we're 90 days in and we had massive and rampant inflation under the Biden administration as a direct consequence of the regulatory policies and the failed policies of the previous administration. I reserve.
Reserves. The gentlewoman from New
I thank the Speaker, and I want to thank the gentleman from Arizona. We've engaged in a colloquy on his time. I'm going to start my 30 minutes. He, of course, is welcome to stick around a little bit if he wants. And I'm going to just jump off from where he started, or I'm going to start from where he left off. And that is to talk about what we're debating on the floor right now, which is the reconciliation bills that we are debating in the House and in the Senate as we speak. Now, for the average viewer out there, you don't understand what we're talking about. Let me put it in basic terms. The reconciliation process is a part of the Budget Control Act, which basically gives us the ability to reconcile current policies with what we're dealing with respect to our spending, debt, deficits, right? We have to make that all add up, and we're supposed to do that in a way that would yield deficit neutrality or deficit reduction. That's the general purpose of why we have reconciliation. Reconciliation, though, because there is a 60-vote threshold in the Senate, and that means certain policies that the majority wants to get in place in the House and the Senate, if they control both chambers, often hit resistance by the minority party in the Senate, that then reconciliation is used to end run what we call the filibuster, even though it's really just a 60-vote threshold, end run that in order to get policy, even though we're supposedly not doing policy on reconciliation. That is how stupid your Congress is, America. That's how you're developing policy, through a bunch of arcane procedures, some of which are great and designed to have cooling effects, some of which are really stupid. But what we're doing is trying to find every which way possible to avoid accountability and responsibility, and that is, as I've been putting it around here to reporters and getting reported out, to do basic math. Because that is, in fact, our obligation, is to do basic math. And unfortunately, a whole bunch of my colleagues on the Democrat side of the aisle and a whole bunch of my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle refuse to do basic math. They want to say that through magic fairy dust and through money trees, they can just wish away the reality that we're going to have a certain amount of inflows and a certain amount of outflows every year. And you want to know why we're $37 trillion in debt, or soon to be? That's why. Now, we're having a big debate, America, on what we should do in this so-called reconciliation process. We are going to have tax policy in there that's going to affect our tax revenues to the government, but more importantly, affect the tax bill you receive. Let me stipulate for the record, when I am attacked a lot in the coming weeks for saying allegedly I want to have tax cuts go up or have taxes go up, I am emphatically for cutting taxes. I would like to zero out the tax code, eliminate the income tax, get rid of the IRS. I would like to do all of those things, and I have legislation to do it. And I will vote for tax cuts, but I refuse to ignore math. If you're going to do a certain amount of tax cuts, which will create a certain amount of economic growth, yes, you still have to model how much revenue will come into the Treasury versus how much you're spending. Because my Republican colleagues love to spend. They campaign on tax cuts. They deliver on most of the tax cuts. They campaign on balancing the budget and cutting spending and never do it, ever. In the history of ever, with the possible exception of the late 1990s, when the Gingrich Republicans, combined with Clinton, and by the way, a dot-com economic explosion, to deliver us a balanced budget. And they did it through welfare reform and through some spending constraint. And that is the only time in modern history where we've done it. Here's the problem. This chart shows you what we're dealing with. A whole lot of people are saying, well, Chip, you and all these fiscal hawks, these fiscal conservatives, you guys want to do all these massive cuts, and we can't do it. And it's crazy what you want to do. Let me be clear what we're talking about. We're currently running close to $2 trillion deficits. If we do all of the crazy stuff we're trying to do, we will be running what? Close to $2 trillion deficits. That's the truth. That's what the models show. That's what we know. So look here. These are the projections of the way things will be if we do nothing. The blue line, we do nothing this year. We let the tax cuts expire, taxes go up, Let me repeat, I'm against that. Taxes go up, revenues are projected to do what they do, and we will have the amount of debt over the next 10 years you see here growing from almost 30-something trillion dollars, growing all the way up to $50 trillion, okay? Now, what do these other lines represent? The orange lines, those lines are the House bill. The red lines were the Senate bill. Well, we just did a thing where we combined the House and the Senate bill into one budget. We're now negotiating that, and this is all yet to be determined. Why am I saying all this? No one wants to read all this. Nobody's going to pay attention to a chart. All my staff, everybody says, don't use charts on the floor. Just go down and say things that will get clipped and sent around. Well, let me try to say something that will get clipped and sent around. Even if the House Republicans are successful in working with the President and the Senate to achieve the $1.5 to $2 trillion in spending restraint over the 10-year budget window, which is a mere $150 to $200 billion a year, even if we're successful, we're going to massively increase the debt in the United States all the way to well over pushing $50 trillion by the end of this budget window. That's it. If we fail, then debt will go up a little higher. We have an obligation to do better. Everything we're fighting for right now in the House is for crumbs. I haven't decided whether I'll vote for it or not vote for it. Why? Because I'm one vote out of 220 Republicans. I'm one vote, and I got to figure out how we build a majority and how the Senate builds a majority and then work with the White House to get a bill signed. I recognize that. But there's a limit that I can accept. And so somebody asked me, I just want the whole world to tell me, should I vote for a bill if we're successful at fighting for what we're fighting for on Medicaid reforms, on unwinding the student loans, on cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, on finding savings and fees on illegal aliens here so that we can pay for continued enforcement of the law at the border? If we're successful in all of those things in terms of revenues and expenses, I'm still going to burden my kids and grandkids with over $50 trillion in debt. All right, what does that mean? Well, it means more interest. It means likely higher inflation, because at some point we can't afford this. That's the fundamental question. Now, I've got a bunch of my colleagues, to the point of the gentleman from Arizona, running around saying, well, we can't touch Medicaid. Well, why can't we? Medicaid was expanded under Obamacare, which we all opposed. And the Medicaid expansion was a big reason why we opposed it. So why can we now not demand reforms to the broken pieces of Obamacare that expanded Medicaid, such that we are giving 90% federal match to the able-bodied, the people who are not the most vulnerable, compared to the vulnerable population who only get 50 to 60 to 70%? Like, why would we do that? Why would we give more to Medicaid recipients than Medicare recipients, which we often do? Why would we continue to allow states like California and other states to game the system to get federal dollars sent back in a money laundering scheme, as has been reported widely by the Wall Street Journal and others? They're openly and knowingly doing it. Why wouldn't we fix that? Why wouldn't we apply eligibility rules and work requirements combined with lowering that abusive federal match rate, subsidizing blue states to game the system, when they're using federal borrowed money to prop up their weak state budget? Why wouldn't we fix that? I don't have a single constituent I know who thinks we ought to continue doing that. And even more so, let me see this chart. My colleagues that are running around say, well, they give into these arguments that we're somehow cutting Medicaid. That's a lie. Now, we could have a debate about whether we should actually reduce Medicaid and give more money in other places, or free up the states to provide better service, or empower Americans to go get the doctor of their choice and be able to afford health care without having an employer or government-provided insurance-run bureaucratic system enriching insurance bureaucrats and pharma and hospitals, because that's what we have. We don't have free health care anywhere in this country. The freest country in the world, you do not have the freedom to go to the doctor of your choice. You don't. The average family in this country is paying $25,000 a year to go to insurance bureaucrats to tell you what handful of doctors you can go to, what lousy deductible you get, what ridiculous copay you have. And I've got a constituent who died from cancer last year who couldn't go to MD Anderson because she was covered on covered on Obamacare. Think about that. Covered on Obamacare. Sick with cancer, can't go to the best cancer hospital in the world 2 hours from her house. That's your healthcare system. And we won't touch Medicaid? Our budget contemplates Medicaid going up 25%. I'm not going to say whether that's good or bad, but can we at least just have the backbone as a Republican Party to not allow our colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the media to say that we're cutting Medicaid when we're increasing Medicaid spending? I mean, it is mind-boggling that we allow that narrative to set in on a program that is broken, that has $1 trillion of improper payments, that is ripe with abuse. What are we here for? I mean, that'd be my question for my Republican colleagues. Why did you run for office? Because I don't recall Republicans running on a big platform of the government is the solution to all your problems. I don't remember growing up as a child of the 80s listening to Ronald Reagan, or frankly listening to President Trump's speeches saying, oh yeah, man, we really love government bureaucracy and all the great things it does for the people. Nobody runs on that. Not a single Republican has run on increasing deficits. Every single Republican has run on balancing the budget. Yet every year we vote for more spending. Every year we vote for more debt. Every year we increase deficits and add to the debt. Every single year. Yet, and I want to get right to the chase here, because for the last 2 months, some of us have been willing to walk out and say that we will not vote for the tax cut extensions if we don't get spending restraint. And I'm getting lots of Republicans around town who like to stir the pot and going and say, well, you're going to vote for a tax increase, are you, Chip? Oh, we're going to hit you hard. We will come after you for voting for tax increases. But they won't say a thing about voting for the inflation tax increase on every American family while they run to the hills on spending restraint, because they won't do it. That's the truth. I didn't come to this town for more of the same. The men and women who walked into a wall of bullets in Normandy, they didn't do it so that we could have $50 trillion of debt and destroy our own country from within. That's what's happening. This country is weaker because the very individuals entrusted to defend her, defend the Constitution, and be responsible stewards of the Treasury have failed them and continue to fail them. And let me be very clear about the budget we're talking about right now. Let's put that back up real quick, if we don't mind. Thank you. You see what happens to the debt under our budgets. They go way up. But I'm not accounting for the other things. What are those other things? Well, this budget, the House budget, it assumes that we're able to figure out how to hold what we call discretionary spending flat. I don't know if the Speaker is the only other person in the chamber with me, believes that we'll hold discretionary spending flat, but history would say we wouldn't. But our budget assumes that we hold discretionary spending flat. That's defense, DOJ, DHS, all of the spending on all of the various programs in commerce, and go down the list. Okay, well, what else? I read a story yesterday that because of tariff policy, and by the way, I support the president using tariff policy to isolate China and restructure our worldwide trade that has been being abused by friend and foe. But I just read a story yesterday that they're planning on how to bail out farmers from tariffs. Well, remember, 7 years ago, we had to spend $25 to $35 billion to bail out farmers for tariffs. This last December, we spent, I don't know, $30 billion or something in a supplemental bailing out farmers. All right, well, what happens when, we need more money for California wildfires? Or what happens when there's a hurricane that hits Florida or, apparently North Carolina, Tennessee? Is that $5 billion, $20 billion, $30 billion, $50 billion? You see, Congress does not have the ability to say no to spending. So let's bring it all back. Should I vote for a reconciliation package that will almost certainly guarantee $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion of deficit spending because I'm getting certain crumbs in cuts in certain committees, and the only reason that I've gotten said crumbs was because we threatened to stop the extension of the tax cuts in order to force the question on spending? Look, I want to absolutely applaud the great work of a whole lot of committee chairs and my Republican colleagues for the work that they've done to identify spending restraint and savings. Education, they found a bunch of savings. I can go through committee by committee. Last night, we added a lot of fees to pay for border security and stuff in the Judiciary Committee. There are other things we could do. But the math is still going to have to be math. We are going to spend about another $300 billion in this bill for defense and border security. That's another $300 billion. We're going to find savings of allegedly $1.5 trillion over 10 years. So that's $150 billion a year. What that means is we're already in the hole. We're already in the hole. By 2035, the United States will be spending more on interest per year than all federal programs aside from Social Security. Right now, federal debt is so large, 40% of all personal income taxes go to paying interest on the federal debt. Think about that. We have over $1 trillion a year in interest. Spending drives inflation. In 2024, the typical American family needed an extra $17,000 a year to maintain the same standard of living as January 2021. We have increased spending, our budget, our federal budget, from roughly $3.6 trillion or so in 2015 to almost $7 trillion now. That's an 80% increase. Does anybody alive think that we can sustain this? Do any of my colleagues, Republican or Democrat, think that we can sustain this? Does anybody alive right now in the chamber, if you're in the complex and you haven't hopped on a plane to fly home because we had our final vote on a Thursday morning and we're going to come back on a Monday night in our usual way of doing things in the swamp, not doing what we should do, does anybody believe that this is going to save the fiscal health of America? Like I said, I haven't decided if I'm going to vote for it or against it. That depends on a lot of variables. The Inflation Reduction Act actually repealed the ridiculous subsidizing that are enriching the Chinese and enriching billion-dollar corporations and undermining our energy security. Do we have the resources necessary to secure the border and the fees to pay for it? Are we putting in the provisions that we ought to be putting in there to guarantee that we're going to have the president be able to carry out his campaign promises to remove aliens? Are we going to have transformational reform to Medicaid so that we eliminate the 90% ridiculous subsidy of the able-bodied while we're giving a much lower rate of 50 to 70% to the vulnerable population? Are we going to continue to allow the provider taxes and the gaming of the system, the money laundering that is allowing money to go to California to be gamed and to be doled out to illegal aliens and put in their general budget as they openly brag? Or are we going to fix that? Are we going to fix the debacle that is the higher education system? Are we going to restrain their ability to abuse federal grants, student loan subsidies? Or are we going to continue to subsidize Harvard, Yale, the Cal Berkeley, University of Texas, Austin, University of Virginia, both my alma maters? I don't care. I'd cut them off. Take away their money. Are we going to continue to do as I heard, which is to create additional taxes on cars? Or are we going to fix it? Literally, in order to pay for the Coast Guard and air traffic control, I heard that the T&I committee, they were poised to put a vehicle tax on every vehicle in America. Limited government, constitutional Republicans were going to tax your car. Well, we fought and said, well, that's a bad idea. So they got rid of the tax, the $50 tax or $20 tax, whatever it was, on internal combustion engine cars, which, by the way, we are subsidizing EVs and hybrids and so forth in order to get the internal combustion engine off the street. But now we're going to tax the EVs that we're subsidizing, unless we repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. These are the tangled webs that we weave in a government in which politicians promise to give away free stuff. As I've said before, we're not the United States House of free stuff. You can't just print money and give it to people and say, oh, we'll take care of your problems. Yet that's what we do. Our best case scenario, if we pass this reconciliation package, is still $50 trillion in debt in 10 years. Like, that's literally the best case scenario. I think it's much worse, especially if our interest is going up and we refinance our debt at higher rates, which seems likely. But here we are, just nibbling around the edges, begging for crumbs. Please, oh please, please give me $150 billion a year in savings on a $7 trillion annual budget, up almost twice in a decade. Bloated and expanded under COVID. Bloated and expanded under both Democrat and Republican regimes. We've had an extraordinary first 100 days. The president has turned around the ship. We're securing borders. Apprehensions are down 94%. We're resetting our position in the world stage diplomatically, economically. We're rebuilding our military, which was being decimated by the previous administration, unwinding DEI, rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in government, firing bureaucrats, identifying all the things that ought to be cut, and that is a good thing. And Congress, my colleagues, are doing some good things. We've passed some good bills that are hitting a wall in the Senate. The SAVE Act, the injunctions bill, a bunch of CRAs to undo the damage of the Biden administration. We passed 5 this week to undo the damage of the EV mandates. We got to stay on offense, and we can, and we're doing a lot of great things, but this reconciliation bill, at a bare minimum, can do no harm. And literally that is what we're begging for, ladies and gentlemen, when we're trying to fight for $1.5 trillion in spending reductions, not even cuts. I want to be clear. I want to remind everybody about Medicaid. Medicaid, there it is. It's going up 25% in our budget, for better or worse. I can make arguments, but just, it's going up. So can we at least speak truth that it's going up and that we're begging for crumbs to get $1.5 trillion in reductions over 10 years? We're going to spend $86 trillion over the next 10 years. We're just trying to save $1.5 trillion of that massive increase for crumbs to have $50 trillion of debt at the end of that rainbow. I hope we'll come together. I hope we'll unite to deliver a product that is worthy of support. I have not decided whether I'll be able to support it. We will find out whether it has what is needed. I do want to take 1 second before I yield to my friend from California to honor a dear friend of mine who passed away a couple of weeks ago. Diana Denman, often called the godmother of the Texas Republican Party. She passed away on April 17th at the age of 91. And I don't do a lot of the floor speeches on individuals because I feel like if I do them for one or two and I don't do them for everybody that I represent, that gets tough. Obviously, veterans, police officers, there are things that rise to the occasion. Diana was a legendary mentor, not just to me, but to many of my friends, many of the people that work for me, many of my staff. She played a major role in the political evolution in Texas, where Texas went from a historic Southern Democrat state to a bastion of conservative Republican politics and a warrior for freedom across the globe. I was proud to have her support, but more importantly, I was proud to have her friendship. She worked closely with some of my dear friends in politics and former bosses like Senator Ted Cruz and Governor Rick Perry, both of whom are dear friends of mine. She led a storied life. She rode her horse into the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. She acted in Hollywood, where she would go on to meet future President Reagan when she was in Hollywood in that golden age. She held many positions in the Reagan administration of the 1980s, and she stood strong against the Soviet Union and the Soviet aggression around the globe. She was truly one of the last Cold Warriors, and I mean that in all of the right and good ways. As a child of the 80s, I consider myself a proud Cold Warrior and believe very much that we need to stand against aggression in the same way President Reagan stood against that aggression and stood for freedom and as a beacon of hope around the world. But I think we could learn from that era, as I learned from Diana, about doing things through peace, through strength. I will miss Diana, and she'll be remembered for her fierce patriotism and her strong convictions. She was feisty. She was committed. She loved her country. I want to thank her for her steadfast commitment to the conservative movement, to the United States, to defending our country, and in service of the Lord Almighty. I'll keep fighting to live free, and I'll remember Diana through those actions, and I will miss her dearly, as will many of my staff who counted her as a mentor. But when I think of the people who have devoted their life to the cause, and they come, and then they go, and they pass, and I'm reminded that we're here for these fleeting moments. What will be our legacy? What will be the legacy of this generation? Are we going to put this country back on a sustainable path? Are we going to actually honor our constitutional commitment to have a limited government in which people can live free? Are we going to constrain the appetite for unchecked spending and the racking up of debt and the deficits and the interests that are killing our economy, our country, and frankly, the futures of our own children? Or are we going to choose the harder path, right? As President Reagan said in 1964, it was a time for choosing. Frankly, we didn't actually heed his call. We chose poorly. We chose the path of a massive bureaucratic, tyrannical state. We've empowered government. We haven't reduced it. We've increased spending. We haven't reduced it. We should actually honor that time for choosing. And in the memory of my good friend who served with President Reagan, let's reignite that call for time for choosing, to choose that path, to choose the path of the Constitution, of limited government, of freedom, of responsible spending, and turning over this country to our children better than we inherited it. And with that, I will yield back. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so concerned about crime in this country that the parting shot of Joe Biden on January 19th was to commute the sentences of 2,500 federal defendants he claimed were, quote, convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. But let's look at that. We had a situation where he reduced the sentence of Laron Graham, 67, a Buffalo man convicted in 2023 of organizing and heading a drug conspiracy to sell fentanyl, crack cocaine, and heroin. When police raided his home, they found fentanyl, crack, and cash. He also possessed a firearm. In addition to heading up the drug gang, Graham was also convicted of sex trafficking by force or coercion from 2013 to 2021. This on top, of course, of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle wanting to defend a Maryland man for being sent overseas after the guy was clearly moving people illegally, beating his girlfriend and wife, violating our laws here illegally, and that's the poster child who they want to defend. There are numerous other examples. Jaron Ruth, 32, another Buffalo native, pleaded guilty in 2019 to selling drugs over a period of 3 years and possessing firearms. He had been charged with shooting a man in the chest during a burglary of the victim's home. These are the kind of folks that Joe Biden was commuting as he exited stage left. We had another situation where he commuted the sentence of a gentleman who left prison after Biden commuted his sentence in the killing of 2 FBI agents. Is that who my colleagues on the other side of the aisle think they ought to be defending? Can they answer the question of commuting the sentences of these violent criminals and putting them out on the street? Just as they voted against every measure that we put forward to defend our borders and to stop the death and destruction of American citizens like Laken Riley or like Jocelyn Nungare or those who have died at the hands of dangerous criminal cartels and gangs in our country. What President Trump is doing is restoring the rule of law. What Republicans are doing are standing up in defense of law enforcement because we stand up in defense of the rule of law. And with that, I would like to yield. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this rule and in support of the underlying legislation. Last night, the Rules Committee met and produced a rule providing for consideration of 3 pieces of legislation: H.R. 2240, H.R. 2243, and H.R. 2255. Will all be considered under a closed rule, each with 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees. Additionally, the rule provides each with a motion to recommit. Republicans are here in Washington this week to continue to work on behalf of the American people. This is, in fact, Police Week, but we have been busy this year, this Congress, delivering for the American people. So far this Congress, we have passed legislation to secure our elections. H.R. 22, the SAVE Act. Hold rogue activist judges accountable. H.R. 1526. Bring transparency to institutes of higher education. H.R. 1048. Make changes to our border with the Laken Riley Act and the Halt Fentanyl Act, and to repeal the Biden-era harmful environmental regulations by passing what we call Congressional Review Acts to undo the damage of the Biden administration. As Republicans continue to work on behalf of the American people and finalize the reconciliation products we are working on currently, we are also here to recognize National Police Week and the thousands of law enforcement officers who wake up every day to step on that thin blue line to defend and protect us. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy signed a proclamation which designated May 15th as Peace Officer Memorial Day and the week in which that date falls as Police Week. Yesterday, my staff and I got the opportunity to welcome police officers from New Braunfels, Texas, and hear about the challenges they face every day. I talk to the men and women of blue virtually every day in the district that I represent, as I know many of my colleagues do. My grandfather was the chief of police of a small West Texas town called Sweetwater. I was blessed to work in the United States Attorney's Office and Office of the Attorney General of the state of Texas, working every day with law enforcement. And what they do matters for the peace and security of our country. Our republic depends on having security on our streets. There are thousands of stories that I could share about the daily heroism of law enforcement officers across the country. Hundreds I could share even in the district I represent. Officer Dalton Schrader and Jason Wright on February 16, 2024, Austin Police Department officers Dalton Schrader and Jason Wright responded to 4-year-old William Martinez Romero, who was choking. The officers quickly jumped into action. Body cam footage shows Officer Schrader run to his cruiser to grab an anti-choking device he had bought with his own money to be prepared for situations just like this, while Officer Wright started supporting William with back blows. They saved his life that day. We must also remember that Police Week honors fallen peace officers, including one officer who died in the line of duty. Austin Police Department Senior Officer Ore Pastore died in action November 11, 2023, responding to a domestic violence call in South Austin. Hostages were held inside a home, and when officers attempted to enter, gunfire started to go off. The SWAT team was called in to help distract the suspect, one being Officer Pastore, who was trying to rescue the victims. I know I speak for many of my colleagues when I say we couldn't be more excited to welcome tens of thousands of law enforcement officers from around the country to D.C. this week. Let's be clear. House Republicans and President Trump have mobilized to restore order and sanity in the United States, something that had been lacking for years. I remember the days, as I know my colleagues do, in 2020, when there were fires and there was destruction rampant across the country, as our cities were being burned to the ground and law enforcement was being targeted. And it was unacceptable. And there are members of this body and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who were encouraging it, who were undermining our law enforcement officers, who were making it more difficult for them to carry out their job, who were challenging them. And it was important that we stood by them. And it is important now that the president and Republicans are standing by our law enforcement officers. Americans suffered due to the amplification of that extreme rhetoric against law enforcement. The homicide rate stayed significantly higher through 2022 after massively skyrocketing in the wake of 2020. The rule before us today is another step in helping law enforcement officers across the nation, which after 4 years of a Biden-run Department of Justice targeting police departments should be a welcome relief to our men and women in blue. This week, we'll consider 3 pieces of legislation to support our brothers and sisters in law enforcement. H.R. 2255, the Federal Law Enforcement Officer Service Weapon Purchase Act of 2025, which would allow federal law enforcement officers the opportunity to purchase the service weapons they used before obtaining a new one. H.R. 2243, the LEOSA Reform Act, which amends the Gun-Free School Zones Act to provide an exemption for law enforcement officers certified under the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act to carry a concealed firearm in a gun-free school zone. And H.R. 2240, improving law enforcement officer safety and wellness through DATA Act of 2025, which would require the Attorney General to submit a report to Congress that includes data to attacks on law enforcement. These bills are widely supported by law enforcement groups: the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies, Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, Major Cities Chiefs Association, Major County Sheriffs of America, National Association of Police Organizations, National Narcotics Officers Associations Coalition, and Sergeants Benevolent Association, NYPD, sent a letter on March 25, 2025 to the House Judiciary Committee urging support of these bills and advancement to the House floor. I reserve. I thank the Speaker. I'm proud of my Republican colleagues for bringing forward legislation in support of our law enforcement community. I'm proud of the fact that, in fact, this president is trying to focus resources where it'll best provide security and safety on our streets and back our law enforcement community to actually target criminals, not fund ridiculous grants, not fund NGOs that are undermining our security, the very NGOs that are perpetuating the open borders, that are putting gangs in our communities like TDA and MS-13 that lead directly to the death of Americans like Jocelyn Dungare, like Laken Riley, like Rachel Marin, like Kayla Hamilton. Americans that are no longer with us because of the policies of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, because of wide open borders and because of tolerance of violent criminals, because of a Democrat president who has let violent criminals out on the street and commuted their sentences, because of radical leftist judges promoted by those that fund my colleagues on the other side of the aisle like George Soros, who have funded DAs that are letting criminals out on the streets in cities like San Antonio and Austin, which I represent. Like my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that have defunded the police time and time again and have defended that position. For example, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said the defund the police movement is one of the reimagining the current police system to build an entity that does not violate us while relocating funds to invest in community services. Another colleague, the defund movement isn't new. Folks are just finally listening. Defund the police, a Democrat colleague. Quote, defunding the police isn't radical, it's real, a former Democrat colleague. And as I said before, a colleague that literally voted on the Austin City Council to strip $150 million out of the police budget, leaving the Austin police stranded. unable to do their job, and the people of Austin unable to get the services that they deserve and pay taxes for, while their streets are made more violent, and while criminals are allowed to roam free under the very aforementioned Soros DAs that refuse to prosecute the criminals. Everybody in America knows what's going on. Everybody in America gets the joke. They saw their cities burning in the summer of 2020. They saw the reality of what happens when you allow these radical Democratic policies to take root. And they want it to end. They want common sense back. They want a president that will enforce the law and an FBI that will target criminals instead of the American people. They don't want to have a federal government that is weaponized against them. They don't want them to be targeted. They want violent criminals off the streets. They want violent gangs off the streets. They want our borders to be secure. They want TDA out. They want MS-13 out. They want fentanyl off of their streets. And the only way you can do that is to actually back up the people trying to enforce the law and actually stand with them in the enforcement of the law and not turn around and let them all out back on the streets. Yet that's what my colleagues perpetually want to do. The fact of the matter is, the American people understand that this president and this Republican House and this Republican Senate and Republican jurisdictions across the country stand for law enforcement. They stand for order. And that's what they want. That's what they sent us here for. Now, we put together some bills this week that are focused on wishes of the people, the men and women in blue, like my grandfather who served as chief of police in Sweetwater, Texas, the many law enforcement I was proud to serve with and alongside in the Office of the Attorney General and in the United States Attorney's Office. We work with them on a regular basis. But when you talk to them, they cannot do their job if the radical leftist policies of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are allowed to continue to be perpetuated. You can't combat crime if you put the criminals back on the streets. You can't combat crime if you import criminals from dangerous prisons. You can't combat crime if your law enforcement agencies are targeting American citizens for political retribution rather than taking dangerous, violent criminals off the streets. I rise in support of these bills. I rise in support of the rule. The legislation that we've put forward will provide value for our men and women in uniform that they've asked for. They've asked for the ability to keep the weapons that they had in service. Now, why does that matter? Well, I'll tell you why it matters. My grandfather that I mentioned before died in 1949 of cancer. When my dad, a 7-year-old, had polio, and my grandmother was a single mom in West Texas raising him, and did all the tough things, didn't ask for any handouts, took 2 jobs, helped my dad go on to be the first to go to college. My dad is still 82 years old. He's still alive. He's 82, still managing to walk, barely. But my dad talks about his dad as a cop, and he pulls out his old .38, the .38 revolver that my grandfather had in service. And that means something to the people that serve. It means something for them to be able to carry that with them and take it with them. It's no small thing. Some of my colleagues dismiss it as being not important. But I can tell you it's important to the people that are out there serving because they devote their lives to this cause. When I take that .38 out of the safe and I can show it to my son, he's holding the .38 that his great-grandfather held and carried with him when he was policing the streets. And I think that is a good thing. I thank the gentleman. Mr. Magaziner has been an excellent partner in this effort, and it's now long overdue. And I'm glad he mentioned my friend Abigail Spanberger. Both of us went to the University of Virginia. It's part of the reasons why we conspired together on this bill when we were talking about how ridiculous it was that on both sides of the aisle, there were blatant abuses of this trust that the American people put in the people that represent them, not to violate that trust by trading securities for profit on the very issues they're supposed to be voting on objectively to benefit the United States of America. Yet that's precisely what has happened. So this is now the fourth Congress in a row that I've introduced the Trust Act, now with Mr. Magaziner, and I think it is now long overdue. In the 119th Congress, we have 12 Republican co-sponsors and 60 Democrat co-sponsors. I would just say to my Republican colleagues, get with the program. 12's not enough. We need to get everybody on board here. I'm glad the Speaker has said that he would support it. I'm glad the President of the United States, President Trump, has said that he would sign it. But we've got to be realistic about what we're talking about. We vote every day on massive issues. We vote about health care policies involving pharmaceutical companies that make billions of dollars, massive insurance companies, massive hospital corporations. We vote on intellectual property issues in the Judiciary Committee. We vote on antitrust issues. We vote on all manners of issues, Defense Department policies that involve hundreds of billions of dollars in the capital markets, and yet members are voting on that while trading stocks on a daily basis. Capital Trades reports that 113 members of Congress made 9,261 trades in 2024 involving 706 million shares or other assets. We had a Democrat who made 4,000 trades for a 20% return. We had a Republican who made almost 2,000 trades for a 23% return. A Democrat, 575 trades, a 22% return. I could keep going down the list. We had members of Congress in 2024, a Republican with 149% return, a Democrat with 142% return, a Democrat with 124% return, a Republican with 111% return, a Democrat with 105% return. I can keep going down. There's a lot of Americans that would like to have returns along those lines. In fact, there are now funds out there that follow and trade along with the congressional members of Congress to see what they're trading. That is ridiculous. You should come to Congress, you should take your assets, you should move them into widely held index funds. We should make it able to be done on a tax basis. Come in here, clean the decks, go represent your constituents. It's long past due. Let's move the bill. Let's get it to the floor. Speaker, bring it to a vote, and let's put trust back in Congress. Thanks, Seth.
Being a great partner on this and a great leader on this issue for many years. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York.
For 30 minutes.
I thank the Speaker, and I would recognize that today is an important day in the history of our country. As we all know, 81 years ago, on June 6, 1944, we had over 150,000 Allied troops who attacked the beaches at Normandy, knowing full well what they were walking into. You had 150,000 Allied forces, tens of thousands of Americans who stormed the beaches. They jumped out of boats into stormy waters, walked into a virtual wall of bullets, went through the fire, went to the cliffs, got shot at on the cliffs, scaled the cliffs, to then have to fight for every yard for the privilege of then getting all the way to Bastogne to sit in foxholes in the freezing cold in Christmas of 1944 while being bombarded by Germans as they were mounting their last offensive. Now, what would cause young men from all over this country to do that? Why would they do that, knowing a huge number of them would not make it through the day? They knew that, but they did it anyway. They knew that when they were jumping out of planes in the middle of the night that many of them wouldn't survive. I saw yesterday in social media photos of dozens of young men who didn't make it through that day, photos from them in the lead up to it that morning and the day before in training. What would cause these young men to do that? And the reason is that They knew that this country was worth fighting for, not because simply of the existence of the country, but because of what this country represents in terms of opportunity to live free and to prosper according to your own talents and to be able to live according to your own conscience under our Constitution and under the principles that were advanced in the Declaration and that are central to Western civilization. And that is what those young men did. We have 400,000 plus Americans who lost their lives to defend this country in World War II. Precious few who survived that conflict are still alive. And if you go down to the memorial here in Washington, you go down to the World War II memorial, and there's 4,000 plus stars that are across the monument, each representing 100 young men who did what I just described, or who did something similar at Iwo Jima, or who did something similar in the Doolittle raid. And again, what would cause them to do it? It is to live free. That's what it's about. I've got a letter that a dear friend of mine named Victoria Coates, who served in the Trump administration in the first administration, from her grandfather Howard. I want to read the letter real quickly. Jane, darling, yep, honey, it's true. Your boyfriend is in it now. I can't tell you how long I've been here or where I am. That will have to come later when I get home. It's the most serious thing I've been in during all of my life. I'm well, though, darling, and still all in one piece. As you said in the last letter I got from you, the one you wrote on Invasion Day, I'm well trained and will take care of myself. Of course, the men come first in our mission, but I'm not taking any chances personally except those in the line of duty. Most all of our officers and men are reacting fine to these new conditions. I have my own platoon and my own headquarters out in the field. Fact is, I'm sitting in my CP now writing this letter. I have Charlie Mugford here as my executive officer, and he's very capable in the field. My staff sergeant is a boy by name of Verbach from Pittsburgh. He's Polish and a darn good man. The Germans killed his grandparents in their invasion into Poland. So you can well imagine his reaction to all of this. The morale of the men is good, and that makes the job easier. Golly, I like my little field setup. I have good radio equipment, also a nice switchboard. Then I have a Jeep and weapons carrier for my CP plus my CP personnel. We get a special dehydrated ration that requires only the adding of a little water. I haven't received the picture yet, but I'm very anxious awaiting it. For supper last night, we had, as an example, baked beans, sausage, cold-packed tomatoes, biscuits, jam, and butter. Please write regularly, I need it. We haven't received any mail since coming to France, but hope to get some soon. That helps plenty. Well, darling, you're ever in my thoughts over here and are my big driving force. I, like the thousands of other Americans, am doing my damn best to get this war over and get home safely to my family. What did they fight for? I can tell you what they didn't fight for. They didn't fight for a Congress to come here and continue $36 trillion of debt and mortgage their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren's future. They didn't come here for this Congress to run away from the fight of policy. They didn't risk everything. They didn't walk into a wall of bullets so that people in this chamber can be afraid of tweets or constituents that come in and talk about, oh, but you're cutting some program. They expected us to actually defend this country in this chamber. $1 trillion of interest every year. We're spending more on interest than we are the entirety of our national defense. I got to be honest with you. I don't know whether the big, beautiful bill is beautiful enough to support. I got to be honest. I voted for it off of the floor to send it to the Senate. There are a lot of important provisions in it. And I need to level set some of those provisions right now, because it is not appropriate for us to run away from the fight now that these young men 80 years ago ran into the fight to preserve. This country will not survive if we mortgage it away. And that's what we're doing. President Reagan was correct when he said that every member of Congress, when they come to this floor and they offer a new bill for a new program, should offer a tax increase to go alongside of it. Because everybody in this chamber, particularly on this side of the aisle, are all too fine offering tax cuts because it's like selling dessert, but refuse to put forward the spending cuts so that people have to eat the broccoli. And that's why we're $36 trillion in debt and growing. And that's why we have $1 trillion of interest. And by the way, as interest rates go up, the price of that debt goes up. We're going to be at $1.5–2 trillion of interest payments because we can't do our job correctly. Now, the big, beautiful bill, let's go through it. The bill is what I would call the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that's the truth. And I'm not going to get into personalities and squabbles and back and forth. The president is right that we need to move a bill through here with tax cuts and spending restraint so that he can get the agenda done that he campaigned on. He's 100% right, and we should do that. Elon is right that this bill doesn't cut enough. That's the truth. Two things can be true at the same time. And the barrier to actually achieving the greatness of moving the big, beautiful bill through that would achieve the president's agenda and achieving what Elon is rightly saying, which is that we should cut more, the barrier is right here in this chamber. It's right over there in the Senate. People unwilling to face their constituents and tell them the truth. Well, I'm going to try to sit here on the floor and tell the truth. I had to hold my nose to vote for this bill 2 weeks ago off the House floor to the Senate. Why? It does not cut enough, and it's not even close to cutting enough. My colleagues say, oh, but Chip, it's the biggest spending decrease in history. Let's be very clear. It is a reduction in future increases of about $1.6 trillion. Yes, that is the biggest amount ever. But guess what? We have sizably more debt and sizably more spending than ever. So of course it should be, but it should be more. $1.6 trillion in cuts or future reductions is really about $160 billion a year over 10 years. That's the truth. The truth is our whole budget has grown from about $3.6 trillion a decade ago to $7.2 trillion now. It's doubled. And everybody wants to applaud themselves for $160 billion of reductions and increases. I'm sorry, I don't think that's good enough. The fact is, our budget, the budget we passed to get the big, beautiful bill through, says that we should be at $6.5 trillion for 2026. But after this bill, if it's passed this way out of the Senate, we'd be at $7.2 trillion. All right, that's a lot of numbers. You want me to tell you back home? The fact of the matter is, unless we have record economic growth for an entire decade, deficits will go up. That's the truth. This bill front loads all of the cost. So for the first 4 years, 26, 27, 28, 29, deficits are up. That is, by the way, on a dynamic basis. You're going to hear a lot of people taking shots at the CBO, and they should. The CBO is biased, the CBO is left-leaning, and the CBO doesn't always get it right. But guess what? No economist ever gets it right. The fact is, we took care of that, at least in part, in the Budget Committee by assuming growth. We assumed economic growth of 2.6%, higher than the last 2 decades average, lower than the historic average. Why does that matter? Because we've already accounted for what you call dynamic scoring, meaning the impact of the tax cuts on revenue. All right, so what does that mean in simple terms? It means that if you look at our analysis, even assuming economic growth and more revenue from that growth, we will still have $400 billion of deficits added to the existing $2 trillion deficit in 2026 because of the bill. Those deficits will go up even more, and it will be another $400 billion or so in 27. 28, we add to the deficits. 29, we add to the deficits. Finally, in 2030, deficits go down. And if you look across the entirety of the 10 years under this bill, you are basically at somewhere around break even on the impact on deficits. Now, again, everybody understand what I'm saying. The deficits of roughly around 1.8 to 2 trillion a year will continue. This bill will adjust taxes and adjust spending, will increase deficits for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then cut deficits in the outer 5 years if you believe that will ever happen. Only in this town do you assume that the good things will happen in 5 years and accept the bad things in the first years. But that's what we're doing. Now, to be clear and to be fair, this does not account for tariff revenue, which is up. Of course, tariff revenue has to be factored into the economic impact of the tariffs. So you got to stir all that in the pot and decide what you think is going to happen. And if you ask me to weigh all of this, I will tell you that on the simple question of whether this bill will add to or decrease deficits, I think it will add to the deficits. Because for the first 5 years, even dynamically scored, they add to the deficits. Even if you assume the current rate of about, I don't know, $250 billion of tariff revenue, which you can't assume because they change, you're still going to be adding to the deficits, even factoring in for the economic impact of growth. Okay, that's all a lot of nerdy speak. Everyone sent us here to save the country. You can't save the country if you're adding to the deficits. You can't save the country if interest rates aren't going to be able to go down because you're being fiscally responsible and the bond markets respond. That's the simple truth. But here we are. And why are we here? Why, despite what I just said, did I hold my nose and vote for the bill? Well, A, as part of the process and hopeful the Senate might work its will to make the bill better. Probably not a good bet. The Senate rarely makes things better. Okay, B, we did get some serious reforms to Medicaid. I'm proud of those reforms. But I do have to be honest with you, they're kind of like breathing. When I tell you the reforms, you're going to be like, wait, we don't do that already? We're simply going to reverse a lot of the damage of the Biden administration and reverse a lot of the damage of the expansion of Obamacare by simply saying this: you shouldn't be on Medicaid if you're able-bodied and can work and you're not working. Now, Democrats will say, oh, you're slashing Medicaid. No, we're not. They're not telling the truth about that. What we're doing is simply saying you should have to work. Same thing for food stamps. My Republican colleagues will say, oh my gosh, these are the biggest savings in history. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'll be like, every American I talk to says, why weren't you doing that already? It's like basic business of Congress. Why would you do that? Why would you provide benefits to people who are able to work and don't? It's insane. So we're going to say, oh my gosh, we saved hundreds of billions of dollars on Medicaid reform by tightening and making sure we're enforcing eligibility and that only the vulnerable get it instead of able-bodied. But we're not doing anything to stop the money laundering scam. We're not doing anything to stop the fact that expansion states under Obamacare get 7 times more money for the able-bodied than the vulnerable. We're going to do nothing about that. We're going to do nothing about the provider taxes that are a part of that scam, that have blue states getting money to give money to illegals and to people for Planned Parenthood and other things because they launder the money through Washington and get a multiple to give it to hospitals and insurance companies and then give them a tax break on the back end. Well documented, well reported, and this body is doing not a damn thing about it because they're too afraid to take on the insurance lobby, too afraid to take on the hospital lobby, too afraid to be honest with the American people. And yet I voted for the bill. Why? Because if we don't, we keep operating under the current system, which means we keep giving Medicaid to people without work requirements. So I'm forced with a conundrum. Do I vote for the bill so I can actually have the common sense of a Medicaid work requirement start in 2026? Or do I vote no on the bill because I think deficit's going to go up and I think this is the bare basics of reform we should do while we're not doing anything to stop the money laundering scam that will likely encourage the 10 non-expansion states to expand and cement Obamacare permanently. This is the Hobson's choice that someone like me or some of my other colleagues face, all under the bluster of what this bill does or does not do, which 90% of the people in this body can't even explain, much less the American people or anybody in the media. That's the truth. We add lots of new tax cuts. Oh, but here's the little secret that everybody should understand. All of the new tax cuts expire after 4 years or 5 years. You want to know a classic Washington gimmick? That's one. You're getting absolutely the bait and switch by Republicans in the House and the Senate by saying we're going to have these tax cuts only be applied for 4 years because they will expire, don't you know, in 4 years, so you don't have to score them now. So there we say, don't worry, over 10 years, this thing, man, it reduces deficits. But they don't score the last 5 years because the tax cuts expire. Now, let me ask you a question. If you're watching this, all 12 of you on C-SPAN, tell me whether you think if we put in place a $500 enhanced child tax credit, I don't care whether you like the policy or not. I have my concerns with the policy. I think it's a giveaway. I don't think it's actually all that helpful. I don't think it creates economic growth. But okay, we're all in the giveaway business in this chamber. We're going to give away another $500 for every child in this country, even though it costs thousands to raise them. But we're only going to do it for 4 years. I'm not allowed to speak and address the audience. I have to address the speaker. But for anybody who happens to be listening in the chamber or on C-SPAN, would you go to Vegas and bet yes or no that those tax credits would be expanded in 5 years? You know damn well they'll be expanded in 5 years. But we don't score that. That's a Washington gimmick. There are 7 of those, I think, or more, of these tax cuts that expire in 4 or 5 years, but are not then scored for the outer 5 years so that everything can balance. But it doesn't. That's $1.6 trillion of additional lost revenue. Now, again, let me be clear. I support a lot of those policies. I don't think we should be taxing Social Security on seniors, either at all or certainly as much. I don't think we should have taxes. Well, let me restate it. I think we should give tax benefits for moving manufacturing to the United States and give rapid depreciation expensing for those companies. I'm for that policy. And that might actually be one of the few that might pay for themselves with the growth. But all of these things, how about the auto loan tax deduction? We've got that in there now. Well, do you think that's going to pay for itself? Do you think they'll let that expire in 4 years when everybody's used to deducting their auto interest? Maybe it's fine policy, but shouldn't we pay for it? Shouldn't we have more spending reductions, or are we going to keep up the fiction that we can continue to do these policies? And all my Republican colleagues go, Chip, they all pay for themselves. Are you a tax raiser? That's what they do. They go, Chip, you're out there, you're saying we got to raise taxes. There's a reason, as I said a minute ago, Ronald Reagan said, if you come down here with a new idea, you ought to have a tax increase attached to it. Because everybody in this chamber cannot say no to the Farm Bureau when they come in and they want more money, when the ALS people come in and say they need more research, when the cancer people come in and say they need more research. I'm a cancer survivor and I tell them no. Because, damn it, we don't have any more money. But everybody in this chamber just says, okay, we're going to authorize more spending. And I'm going to go do a tax cut because, oh, that's your money. You get to keep your tax. I agree. Let me be clear. They're all going to sit there. They're going to go play some clip, Chip Roy's for tax increases. It's all crap. But the truth is, everybody in this chamber says every tax cut pays for itself. What if I cut taxes to 1%? Do those all pay for themselves? No, they don't. And we owe $36 trillion. And everybody watching this, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids are holding the bag because you wanted all your free crap. And as I've said before in a speech, this is always the United States House of free crap. And that's what we do. We just write checks. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Green New Scam. I'm going to tell you the one reason I voted for this bill. One, yes, I like the Medicaid work requirements. Yes, I like a lot of the extensions of the tax cuts. Yes, I like some of the policies that stop funding Planned Parenthood. Yes, I like some of the policies that stop funding transgender surgeries. All of those are good. But in my opinion, we needed more spending restraint if you want to be honest about deficits. But I voted for this bill for one reason, and this is why I'm on the floor today. Because I need the United States Senate to hear this as clearly as I can say it. We got restrictions on the Green New Scam to ensure that about 55 or 60% of those subsidies that are going to enrich billion-dollar corporations to put money in the pockets of the Chinese, to undermine our grid with unreliable energy and undermine natural gas and undermine nuclear, all while bolstering wind and solar, which is littering our fields and littering our landscape, all to provide unreliable energy. We fought like hell to get restrictions on that, to get 60% of the Green New Scam basically terminated. The president campaigned on terminating all of it, but this weak-ass Congress and Senate are going to not do that because, we can't disrupt the existing flow of the $400 billion of subsidies going into the pockets of all those big companies raking in the money so they can get free money while you guys all subsidize, they're getting rich, and your grid gets weaker. This Congress is going to do that. And we fought like cats and dogs to get that 60%. And everybody in town, the K Street lobby, are freaking out. Oh no, we're not going to be able to have our subsidies to build more wind farms and solar farms. We're not going to have more giveaways because their energy won't compete. So that is the one reason I voted for this bill. So my message to the Senate, this will get clipped. It will get sent to the Senate. I'm looking at you, Tom Tillis. I'm looking at you over there in the Senate. You backslide 1 inch on those IRA subsidies, and I'm voting against this bill. I want the White House to hear it. I want the Senate to hear it, because it is the only reason I voted for this bill. Because those godforsaken subsidies are killing our energy, killing our grid, making us weaker, destroying our landscape, undermining our freedom, and I'm not going to have it. So you do what you want to do in the Senate, House of Lords, have your fun. But if you mess up the Inflation Reduction Act, Green New Scam subsidies, I ain't voting for that bill. We have a duty to actually honor 81 years later. All these colleagues of mine, both sides of the aisle, they'll go out. You watch. Today, D-Day, there'll be a tweet from everybody. June 14th, the 250th birthday of the Army, there'll be a tweet from everybody. July 4th, they'll get in their parades. They'll walk around, they'll flag, they'll kiss babies, yay. What do they do on Veterans Day? What do they do on Memorial Day? But what are we doing to actually honor the memory of those who gave the last full measure of devotion, who walked into the wall of bullets, who died for this country? So we could be $36 trillion in debt? So we could subsidize the Green New Scam? So that we can run away from the fight of having a tough conversation with constituents that there in fact is no more room in the inn, that we are out of money? Because I got to tell you, this bill does not meet the moment. I voted for it because I believe strongly in stopping those Green New Scam subsidies and for a variety of other good provisions. But we ought to do better. The Senate ought to do better. And if the Senate weakens it, shame on the Senate. And if the House just takes it, shame on the House. The President of the United States campaigned on terminating the Green New Scam. We should terminate it. The President of the United States said that we should get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicaid. Well, we should, including the money laundering scam, enriching blue states at the expense of red states, expansion states at the expense of non-expansion states, and enriching the able-bodied at the expense of the vulnerable. The President campaigned on tax relief. We should deliver it. But we should have the commensurate spending cuts to go alongside of it to ensure that deficits go down, to do what the President also campaigned on, which is balancing the budget of the United States. I do not believe this bill yet will do that. We'll see what the Senate does over the next week. But we will do a disservice to the memories of those that we are celebrating today on the 81st anniversary of D-Day. And we'll do a disservice to the memory of all those who came before us, to fought and died and bled for this country. But more importantly, we will do a disservice to their ancestors, a disservice to our kids and our grandkids, who are the ones left holding the bag of rampant inflation and high interest rates and a bond market that is teetering on the edge of a knife's edge because we refuse to do our job. We have an obligation to do. And I hope the Senate will step up and make this bill better. If they leave it the same, they can send it to the president's desk. They leave it basically the same and they send it back, I guess a lot of us will hold our nose again and say, well, I guess that's the best this Congress is capable of doing. It's like General Patton's quote in the movie. Well, what did you do during the great WW2? Well, you won't have to say you shoveled crap in Louisiana. Well, what is Congress going to say that they did at this moment in time in history to save this country? I hope the Senate will listen, make this bill better, make it deserving of the president's campaign and mandate, and deliver for the American people. But they better darn well not backslide. Because frankly, it was hard to hold my nose to vote for that bill in the first place because I'm over the barrel trying to actually make Medicaid work and try to make these subsidies get repealed and try to do the job that the president campaigned on, while we are too inclined to want to have giveaways that don't simply add up. This is a moment for us to rise up and deliver. I hope the Senate will do it, and I hope the House will follow. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back.
Members are reminded to address the remarks to the chair and not to receive viewing audience. The question is, for what purpose does the gentleman from Texas wish to be recognized?
Mr. Speaker, I would move to adjourn.
The question is the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas and Rules Committee member, Mr. Roy.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairwoman. So here we are. Democrats couldn't seem to find a single thing to say about Epstein when President Biden was in office, but now they want to make this the centerpiece of their entire conversation. The fact of the matter is right now, the fact of the matter is...
The House will be in order.
The fact of the matter is
the gentleman will suspend.
The fact of the matter is they know it's true.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman may proceed.
The fact of the matter is they know it's true, and right now what they don't want to do is have the American people focusing on the Republicans in Congress who are doing the thing they sent us here to do, which is end wasteful spending, to stop the ridiculous spending of a bureaucratic government that has been weaponized against the people. Dollars that are being used and wasted being sent around the world for $32,000 for transgender comic books in Peru. That's how they want to use taxpayer money. We're over here trying to make sure we're saving that money. Instead of having $5 million to fund tourism or $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt, or $2 million for sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala. Why should the people of Texas be paying for that instead of paying to clean up the flood in Texas? The fact of the matter is the people of Texas want their money to be used for the things they care about. But we listen to the minority leader come to the floor and lecture us about the virtues of public radio and public broadcasting. Yet, nevertheless, the truth is it took NPR through Texas Public Radio 19 hours to post anything about the flooding on its social media pages after the floods hit in Texas. What was NPR and Texas Public Radio doing that morning? They weren't breaking to talk about what was happening in Texas. They were running ads saying people should call Congress to fund them. But the private stations in Texas were breaking to release reports and to tell people what to do, because that's what private stations can do, because they respond to the people, because they're locally owned, they're locally run, and they're not run by the bureaucrats from this town. The fact is, we're going to save money for the American people and end the absurdity of this leftist propaganda being put out under public radio. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity, as always, to be here in the House chamber and try to be a voice for the people across this country. The people that I represent, of course, as does the Speaker and my colleagues. We each represent 750,000 people, give or take. But we also try to be a voice for everybody. We try to be a voice for the people who don't have a voice. And the people that I represent and the people across this country that I talk to are sick and tired. They're sick and tired of being put in danger because radical progressive Democrats, radical progressive politicians, radical progressive judges, radical progressive district attorneys, radical progressive NGOs, George Soros, the people funding all these entities, are pushing criminals onto the streets of our country and causing harm to Americans. Americans who have been here for generations, or Americans who came here seeking refuge from, for example, Ukraine. How many of my colleagues come to the floor of the House wearing a blue and yellow ribbon or blue and yellow pin? And they wear it for show. And they wear it to pat themselves on the back. And they wear it to seem like they're the ones with a heart, when other people question whether we should fund endless war. But they wear it to say that they care. But where were they when Irna Zarutska was being brutally stabbed in public transit in North Carolina? Where is the media who were outraged when Daniel Penny, a Marine, stopped a violent offender on a New York subway and then was the one being charged and prosecuted for a crime? Would that Irna Zarutska have had Daniel Penny sitting next to her so that she wouldn't lose her life as a refugee from Ukraine, coming to supposedly the freest and strongest and greatest country on earth, just to be brutally murdered because feel-good radical liberals with their jailbreak, let all the criminals out, open borders, take money from George Soros, DAs and judges putting these criminals on the streets, to have a guy who was a 14-time offender, 14-time offender, sitting behind this beautiful girl and just stabs her to death on a train car. Where is all the wailing and the gnashing of teeth from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle? Where are their blue and yellow ribbons today? All of the sanctimonious preaching sure is silent, because they can't bear to acknowledge that if you don't enforce the law, if you invite criminals from around the world into our country with open borders, if you let criminals on our streets with foolish policies by radical judges and district attorneys, then, as my friend from Louisiana knows, as a former law enforcement officer, our streets are no longer safe, and the American dream is no longer able to be achieved. And the freedom we're supposed to enjoy is not possible without the security you're supposed to have under the rule of law. We use a lot of big words. From the Declaration of Independence all the way through today, we talk about a lot of great words. Equal justice under the law, liberty, rights, freedom. But if you don't have the rule of law, none of it matters. The reason people come to the United States, the reason they flock to our country from around the world, is because of the rule of law. Enforcing our constitutional rights given to us by God, recognized by our founders, defended with the blood of patriots, but enforced under the law. They come here knowing they can invest their capital, build a business, and not have it taken away by the state. They know that they can walk the streets freely, or they think that they can walk the streets freely and not be assaulted. They believe that they can raise a family and grow and develop a community and live the American dream that they've seen play out. So they want to come here. But then when people with their fake ribbons and their feel-good propaganda let criminals on the streets, ignore the rule of law, and walk away from the men and women in blue, as they did in the summer of 2020 when our cities were burning and our law enforcement were being attacked, when they defund the police in Austin, Texas, as the radical city council did there, then real people suffer. Americans get hurt. And the American dream dies. The suspect that I talked about with the brutal stabbing in North Carolina, 34 years old, history of mental illness, long rap sheet, had multiple convictions, armed robbery, felony larceny, breaking and entering, more than 5 years in prison, 14 criminal cases. His own family had warned of his history with schizophrenia. His own sister said, quote, he didn't seem like himself when he was released from prison. Assaulted his sister. And now that guy's roaming the public. His release from this incident was conditioned on a written promise that he would appear for his next hearing, only for him to be charged with murdering this young woman. Why would North Carolina office holders, why would North Carolina politicians, judges, not confine or institutionalize this young man? Because a radical ideology has taken root, particularly in my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but my colleagues on this side of the aisle are not immune to the belief that you can put criminals on the street and not undermine the American dream. The so-called progressive prosecutor movement advocates for less incarceration and less policing, decarceration, pro-criminal policies that undermine public safety. On January 22nd, 2025, San Antonio Police Department officers responded to calls at a San Antonio apartment complex reporting a suicidal individual who was armed and firing his weapon. When officers arrived, the suspect, Brandon Scott Polis, fired upon the officers, striking one of them in the leg. Polis wound up barricading himself in an hours-long standoff and shot an additional 6 officers before San Antonio PD neutralized the situation. Thankfully, all 7 officers survived. But he was a 46-year-old with a history of erratic behavior. He was charged with DWI and assault. And a few days before the shooting, he had been arrested for 2 charges of injury to an elderly person, 1 charge of assault family violence, causing bodily injury, and 1 charge of driving while intoxicated. The Bexar County Magistrate's Office, Bexar County is where San Antonio is, issued a protective order against Polis with instructions not to contact the family members. 3 days later, and less than 24 hours before the January 22nd shooting of 7 San Antonio cops, Polis violated his protective order by visiting a prohibited residence, threatening to kill himself and shoot at any officer. The Bexar County DA in San Antonio, led by a progressive prosecutor, has imposed criminal leniency initiatives that have not only put law-abiding Americans in danger, but also police officers too. The fact is, we are letting the inmates not just run the asylum, we're letting the inmates run our communities. And then we're inviting other countries under the Biden administration to dump their prisons out into our communities. And the radical progressives who allowed that to happen, supported it, and encouraged it, are now attacking President Trump for daring to undo the damage, to reverse the open borders, to secure them, and then try to remove the dangerous criminals that are walking the streets of the United States because of the radical progressives and their open border policies. I know my friend from Louisiana has a lifetime of service, not just as a congressman, but also in law enforcement. And I wonder if my brother from Louisiana would like to expand upon my thesis that the rule of law is the central element to a strong and prosperous United States, and that when our radical progressive friends undermine it by releasing criminals, leaving our borders open, refusing to enforce the law, handing down light sentences, that it endangers our people and undermines the very American dream that people seek to come achieve when they come to our land. I would yield to my friend from Louisiana.
For allowing me to address these concerns.
I thank my friend from Louisiana. I want to put a name and a face on the environment that was created by our colleagues and by the previous administration in endangering the people. We talk about say his name. Say his name. Say the name of Jimmy Friesenhan. In San Antonio, a father of a young daughter, a veteran of the Marine Corps, Jimmy fell victim to the program that my friend from Louisiana just described. On May 4th of 2025, a mere 4 months ago, he was working as a security guard at a restaurant on the west side of San Antonio. The perpetrator, Wilmer Vladimir Ruiz Ortega, attempted to enter the bar, stopped by Jimmy to search for contraband. Jimmy identified a handgun, and it led to a struggle, which resulted in the suspect gaining control of it, firing it, and striking Jimmy at least once. Jimmy medically died on the scene but was revived. It struck him in the neck, leaving him with a spinal injury, along with a ruptured esophagus and vocal cords. He was in the ICU at San Antonio Military Medical Center with life-threatening injuries for months. Doctors say he will never fully recover. The suspect is a 29-year-old illegal alien who entered the United States as a getaway. He was arrested in San Antonio and charged with DWI in 2020. He was let go on a personal recognizance bond, but failed to show up. The Bexar County DA downgraded the DWI. He pleaded guilty to obstructing a passageway, but violated the probation, got arrested again, was let go after posting $1,500 bond, failed to show up. He was arrested a fourth time in November of 24, sentenced to time served. He assaulted a girlfriend, fled the scene, and then the Bexar County DA, after shooting Jimmy, only pursued aggravated assault charges and set his bond at $200,000. He's not in jail. He was granted house arrest. A father, a veteran. His brother said Jimmy always put himself before others. Well, why do the people entrusted with securing our communities and enforcing the law not put Jimmy before the illegal alien who shouldn't have been here, should have been removed, shouldn't have been let out 5 times to carry out and perpetrate this kind of crime? The American people are asking, what happened? What happened to our country? How can a refugee from Ukraine, you remember when our colleagues waved all the Ukrainian flags on the House floor? Where were they today? Were they waving the Ukrainian flag to honor that young girl who was brutally murdered by a criminal, released by a radical progressive, funded by radical progressives? They're nowhere to be found. MIA and the legacy media, also run by radical progressives, can't even bring it up, can't even put it on the television, don't dare to talk about it because it doesn't fit the narrative. The American people are sick of having their way of life that their forefathers fought and bled and died for, and that their brothers and sisters, moms and dads worked to build for them and to pass down to their kids. They're sick of having it ripped to shreds by people who don't give a rip about the rule of law or the Constitution or our way of life as God-fearing Americans who say that we put our trust in God right above the flag that those brave men and women wore into combat so that we could be here and live supposedly free. But we're unable to live free because we're not secure. And we're not secure because radical politicians and judges and NGOs are working furiously for political gain and political purposes to advance a radical Marxist ideology to undermine your security. It is a war on our way of life. It is a war on Western civilization itself. It is a war on the Constitution and the rule of law. Every day that goes by is another day in which the very things that built this country are under assault, including, I might add, and no doubt controversially, our belief in the Almighty God and His Son punished for our transgressions on the cross, and our collective belief in Him as a nation that built this country. And this country, and too many of its citizens that have turned its back on that truth. The fact is, the last point I'll make, those radical progressives with their remaking of America, with wide open borders. And open borders includes unfettered visas from all corners of the world, purposely driven for economic, political, and other purposes, but usually involving the buck and power. The people that are advancing Sharia law and advancing an Islamist political worldview directly and purposely in conflict with our Western values and our Constitution, it is a declaration of war on our way of life. In Houston just this weekend, an imam affiliated with the Nation of Islam was going around claiming to be patrolling Muslim-owned shops, telling them to stop selling alcohol, lottery tickets, because they violate Islamic law. As communities in Texas are built up on large pieces of land, hundreds of acres, building up Muslim-only cities. This is purposeful. We had Nigel Farage and others testifying in the Judiciary Committee this past week. And I asked Mr. Farage if the advance of Islam and the importation of Sharia law is consistent with Western civilization, the Western civilization responsible for providing more peace and more prosperity and better living conditions and more freedom for more people than the world has ever seen. And his answer was, of course, no, it is not. And our friends across the pond can barely find themselves able to defend what little free speech remains on their island. When a comic comes to the United States, a comedian, and he makes a joke about transgenderism, I don't even know what the joke was, and he flies home to the UK and he's arrested for hate speech, even as the parliament is advancing an Islamophobia bill. To which I say, who's going to win that war? Who's going to win that fight? We either believe and uphold the values of Western civilization or we don't. You can believe what you want. You can believe in God or not. You can go to church or not. But what you cannot do is advance a radical ideology deeply at odds, directly in conflict with, and purposely designed to undermine the very values that have built this nation and the advance of freedom around the world. Because at our core, our values are built on our faith. This nation is more likely to crumble under its own weight, its own errors, than it is by invasion. Unless we meet the moment, unless we stand up, unless we say, never again. Never again will we allow the power of government to be rained down upon the American people with mandates of masks and vaccines in the name of fear, in the name of health care. Never again will we allow open borders to trample our communities, endanger our citizens, filter dangerous narcotics into our communities. Never again will we allow the Chinese Communist Party to buy up our lands and to buy up our meatpacking facilities and to buy up our critical medical production companies. Never again will we allow our communities to get overrun with forced Marxist DEI and critical race theory ideology that undermines the very fabric of our communities. Never again will we allow the lawless, the dangerous criminal to be on our streets because a faraway judge or bureaucrat getting paid off by an NGO says so. Never again. Never again. This moment of reprieve, this moment of common sense in which President Trump is restoring a modicum of what we need to restore the rule of law and secure borders and enforcement of the law and removal of criminals, meeting resistance at every turn. Even this moment of reprieve in which the President Trump, is restoring common sense by eliminating DEI and CRT and all this stuff from our agencies and our Pentagon. Even this moment of reprieve is just that. A moment of reprieve from the march of the Marxist tyrannical ideology that is deeply at odds with our founding principles and who we are as a Judeo-Christian nation and as people who believe in something bigger and better for our kids and grandkids, rooted in the sacrifice of the millions who came before us. This reprieve must be met with the energy and the resolve of those who died before us. The men on the wall at the Alamo, the men who stormed the beaches at Normandy, the men on the fields at Lexington and Concord, the men and women who have answered the call to defeat terror, the men and women in blue who actually stand on that thin blue line even when they're abandoned. All of those who have answered the call deserve members of this body, members of the Senate, elected leaders across the country to risk even an ounce of what those men and women are willing to risk. Risk the election certificate upon which you hold like a death grip, I say to my colleagues, to do something bigger and better. Take this moment of reprieve and say, never again. Never again will we endanger our citizens. Never again with open borders. Never again with criminals on our streets. Never again with drugs. Never again with tyrannical mandates, vaccines stuck in the arm. Never again with radical ideologies and transgender ideology, politically motivated, harming our young women, undermining their advancement. Never again. Never again do we yield to the corporatists who gobble up our small businesses and undermine our way of life. Never again will we yield to ideology in the name of political expediency, but rather stand up and defend this, the greatest country that the world has ever known, without which people will be relegated to a world without the American dream, backed by the security and safety of the people willing to lay all on the line to defend it. With that, I thank my friend from Louisiana. I thank the Speaker. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives, sir. This is to notify you formally, pursuant to Rule 8 of the Rules of the House of Representatives, that I, Evelyn Cruz, District Director to the Honorable Nydia Velasquez, U.S. Representative for the 7th Congressional District of New York, have been served a third-party deposition subpoena in litigation before the Supreme Court of the State of New York. After consultation with the Office of General Counsel, I have determined that compliance with the subpoena is consistent with the privileges and rights of the House. Signed sincerely, Evelyn Cruz.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Thank the Speaker. The gentleman from Georgia. I move to adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
Thank the Speaker, my friend from Texas. I would note just an observation. One of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who is a cancer survivor, and God bless him for it, was raising issues about government funding and about what funding should or shouldn't exist and what this administration may or may not be doing to make sure our bureaucracies are running efficiently and effectively and not wasting money. I say this as a cancer survivor, stage 3, Hodgkin's lymphoma 13 years ago. Look, I think research is important. I think we need to make sure there's solid research. I think it can be driven heavily by the private sector, who are incentivized to make money for developing life-saving drugs. But it can be done in concert with governments and universities. But what we don't need is continued profligate federal funding in order to achieve greatness. You know, the Wright brothers, Henry Ford, the great inventors, the great industrialists, the great innovators in technology, the entrepreneurs out there, for the most part, they're not doing that based on government funding and action. They're doing it based on innovation and hard work. And that should be our model and approach. So while I appreciate those who have gone through a terrible disease, like cancer, as I did, as a number of people in this chamber, as millions of Americans across this country have done, it's not always a rationale for more government spending and more government action and more government bureaucracy. And I would note that the other colleague who came down and talked about high and rising energy prices, I too share some frustration about foreign-owned energy companies and utility companies. But I would remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that our energy prices wouldn't be skyrocketing and off the charts had we not gone down the road, the foolish road, of massive subsidies for the so-called Green New Deal, which is more rightly called the Green New Scam, in which foreign companies, Chinese companies, have been enriched because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle wanted to pursue their radical agenda. And you want to know why prices of energy are going up? Because of your policies, because of your mandates, because of your EV mandates, because of your mandates about solar panels and wind farms that are far less efficient than nuclear and clean-burning natural gas. Those things are driving up the price of energy for the average American and putting that money in the pockets of a handful of wealthy people and the Chinese. Congratulations. Don't come whining to Congress about what you need to do to deal with high energy prices that you caused. And that's the truth. And the fact of the matter is, we need to do a lot better job of speaking truth here in this chamber. And I'm reminded, as a number of my colleagues were debating a resolution honoring a friend to many of us, Charlie Kirk, who, as is well known now, lost his life last week. I am reminded of the importance of truth. Truth matters. And Charlie stood for the proposition that you should go into the public square and put forward your ideas and put forward what you believe is truth, and then hash it out. And he did so eloquently, thoughtfully, and engagingly with people of all stripes. Black, white, straight, gay, male, female, whatever it was, he would engage with people on campuses and around this country to pursue truth. One of my favorite quotes of Thomas Jefferson is, "For here we are willing to pursue truth wherever it may lead." Follow truth wherever it may lead. But you also have to have the courage to speak truth. Charlie Kirk, when he was engaging with Bill Maher just earlier this year, said, and I quote, "In China, and of course in the Soviet Union, there was an anti-Christian movement, very hardcore. What book do you think is best for humanity to live by? I say the Bible. The entire arc of the Bible is a story of love and a need for humanity's redemption. The Bible has wisdom in ways you might not ever imagine. Humanity will seek to find a book. They'll seek to find a code to live by. And I think it is incumbent upon atheists to tell us what that should be." Speaking to Bill Maher, a skeptic. Charlie Kirk earlier this year in April, "The mechanisms of a religious society are good for everybody. When somebody walks around and thinks that you were created and that you're not God, you tend to have better citizens." Charlie was not wrong. Earlier this year, Charlie Kirk, in a debate with an atheist, quote, "I would argue you have a lot more faith than I do. You have a lot more blind faith to believe that everything around you, love, joy, peace, sadness, is all just a construct of neurons firing in your brain. We as Christians have hope that we are going to see our loved ones again, and that we will be in heaven, and that we will be in perfect peace, and that this is not it. In fact, there's something even better awaiting us." Also earlier this year, also with Bill Maher, quote, "The greatest minds of history have been mesmerized by the scriptures. Isaac Newton, Thomas Aquinas. Isaac Newton wrote more about biblical prophecy than even physics. And so there's something about the scriptures that are intellectual, that push your limits. And that's what I think is so beautiful about our faith, is it can be accessible to everyone, but infinitely nourishing in exploration." Earlier this year, Charlie said about his goal of conservatism, he said, "You have to try to point them toward ultimate purposes and toward getting back to the church, getting back to faith, getting married, having children. That is the type of conservatism that I represent. And I'm trying to paint a picture of virtue, of lifting people up." In another exchange with Bill Maher, "It defies reason to think that this is just a roll of the dice. When you see a baby come into the world, when you see how we naturally heal, when you see even consciousness itself, I think it is a pretty miraculous thing. To think that it's all just a bunch of happy accidents, I think it's more rational to think that it's a byproduct of design." 4 days before Charlie was shot, he, I think, tweeted out, "Jesus defeated death so you can live." Earlier this year, Charlie said, quote, "I want to be remembered for courage for my faith. That would be the most important thing. The most important thing is my faith." I could go further, My point of sharing these things is the importance of us standing up and speaking truth. And people say, well, Chip, how can you say it's truth? It's just what you believe when you talk about your faith. Well, I, of course, believe it to be true. It is truth. Jesus did die so that we may live, and Jesus lives. It is important that we remember our nation's founding and our nation's convictions and the spirit that binds us together as a nation, actual spirit. In God we trust. We cannot be bound together as a nation if we do not adhere to a common set of principles and values rooted in a collective faith in God Almighty. That does not mean that every individual has to believe anything specific. It doesn't mean that anybody has to go to church. It doesn't mean that we have to go around doing something in violation of the First Amendment, which says you can believe what you want to believe. But the First Amendment also does not stand for the proposition that we should walk away from our collective faith. It does not do that. In nowhere in the First Amendment does it say that. How does a nation conquer evil? How does a nation conquer Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union? Was it all because we just got together and decided to put together a military? Or was there something bigger? Was there something more important? Was there a collective faith in the Almighty that bound us together and gave us the courage for those young men to walk into a wall of bullets at Normandy? People always ask me, what is wrong with our country? Why is there so much division? When the nation turns its back on God, when the nation walks away from that collective faith, then do we really even have a nation? A lot of people keep branding Charlie as a conservative activist. Sure, he unapologetically advanced his definition of conservatism. But remember, as I said, when he tried to define that conservatism, he talked about it in the context of faith. He said, as I said a minute ago, you have to point them toward ultimate purposes and toward getting back to the church, getting back to faith, getting married, having children. That is the type of conservatism that I represent. And I got to be honest, that should be the essence of conservatism and the essence of who we are. What point is there to living free if you're not advancing toward the kingdom of God? Charlie had courage to speak to this, to raise these issues to a lost generation, consumed into devices that are destroying the minds of our youth. Devices that I would wipe away from the face of the planet tomorrow if I could. I would. God's honest truth. The Amish are onto something. But since I can't do that, can we not at least recognize that these are poisoning our children? The first thought I had after I had gotten word that Charlie was shot was to call my wife and to figure out how to get word to my son, also named Charlie, who I knew was an enormous fan of Charlie Kirk and who does not have social media or access to it on his telephone, but is around a lot of friends who do, and to get word to him not to look at anything. Because I knew immediately that the horrific images would be spread around instantly. And no children should be watching that. And that's just one example of millions every day polluting the minds of our children, coarsening our culture, breaking us down, addicting our children to devices instead of engagement and conversation and life and family and being outside. We are at each other's throats because we've turned our back on God. We're at each other's throats because nonstop there's a deluge of imagery and horrific thoughts that are flooding into the inboxes and into the visibility of our children and, frankly, ourselves. Charlie was correct. Charlie Kirk was correct that we have to focus on getting back to church, getting our nation, our families, our communities back to church. Would that this Sunday, everybody that's going to be at a National Football League game or parked in front of a TV watching an NFL game, would that every single American doing that would be in church with devices off, TVs off, having supper with their families? Which society would be stronger? The fact of the matter is, when I had to tell my son that unfortunately Charlie had passed, and I said, he asked if that was formally known in public, and I said yes. I said, he's gone. I'm sorry, buddy. He said, I would have loved to meet him one day. And then he sent me a Bible verse. He said, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Well, thank goodness his mama's doing something right. A lot of people have asked me why one of my first reactions in light of all of this was to raise the prospect of an organized radical left that has been fomenting the targeting of people that I care about, people like Charlie Kirk, people like the Family Research Council, targeting families and communities and our way of life. Chip, why would you do that? Aren't you just sowing more division in calling for a select committee to investigate the organized effort of the radical left? I actually think it's the opposite of that. I started this talking about the need to pursue truth. Our job in Congress, in part, is oversight and investigation and pursuing truth and exposing it to the American people. It is a problem that organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, in creating hate maps in which they target the Family Research Council, a decade ago resulting in an individual shooting it up and a security guard getting shot right here in D.C. Or Charlie Kirk's organization, TPUSA, being put on that same map with a target being put on their backs. Antifa, known to be radicalized and engaging in terrorist activities, which the president recognized just yesterday, I believe rightfully. the extent to which there is an extraordinary network funded not just by George Soros, but a large number of radical billionaires that are funding organizations dedicated to putting into office DAs and judges who put criminals on the street, who allow dangerous criminals to walk among us in our communities, on trains in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a young woman from Ukraine was butchered by someone who had been in and out of arrest and jail 14 times. It's not just an accident. It's not just one random DA or judge or, oh, George Soros funded one election. It is a coordinated effort to put DAs and judges and other law enforcement officials into places in communities, including in the communities I represent in Austin and San Antonio and throughout Texas, purposely, to then have organizations like the Wren Collective, which is now known through reporting just this week from the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, putting out the known networks where they're going in and telling these DAs and prosecutors precisely what to do, precisely how to get people back on the streets sooner or not prosecute them at all. The result of this is that dangerous individuals are walking among us and hurting our loved ones, which is a direct threat to the security of our nation. So yes, I think we should investigate that. Yes, I think we should get to the bottom of that. Yes, I want to know how those dollars are flowing. Yes, I want to know why the people of San Antonio have to be turned upside down, or the people of Charlotte, North Carolina have to be turned upside down because a radical group of billionaires are funding organizations that are funding these people to be put on our streets. How about our borders? Should we not know the flow of the dollars of the coordinated network through the United Nations and through international organizations and through supposedly religious organizations, or the 250 organizations that our friends at the Center for Immigration Studies put out, demonstrating the network that was responsible for dumping millions of people into our communities, including violent gang members from around the world, that resulted in the death of Americans. Americans like Jocelyn Nungare, Americans like Laken Riley, Americans like Rachel Marin, and I could go down the list of people who were killed, abused, assaulted, harmed, because a radical group of leftists decided that open borders for their political purposes was more important than your safety and security as Americans. So yes, I think we should have a select committee or an organized effort among the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee to expose this network, to expose the funders, to expose the people that are doing this purposely to undermine your security as a nation. Yes, we should know that. And the only question is, why aren't every single representative in this body standing up and saying, yes, I agree? I agree with Vice President J.D. Vance, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, and they put forward plans to go after leftist non-governmental organization in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder. The Vice President said, we're going to go after the NGO networks that foment, facilitate, and engage in violence. We're going to channel all the anger that we have over the organized campaign that led to this assassination to uproot and dismantle these terrorist networks. The Vice President is correct. My friend Stephen Miller is correct. The President is correct to be declaring Antifa a terrorist organization. Enough is enough. Enough with the disruption of our nation. And for those that say this is somehow clamping down on speech, wrong. You can say virtually anything you want to say in this country. But But number one, there's consequences to that, including getting fired, including having television shows canceled, because there's a limit to what a society should have to take. And if you're going to say crazy things, then there can be a consequence to saying those crazy things. And that is okay. And no, it is not interfering with your First Amendment rights to say that you cannot engage in effectively conspiracy to foment violence, including, by the way, the riots in 2020. In the false name of supposedly healing racial division, or in this name of certain lives mattering, because we want to divide our country further. Organizations funded for a specific purpose to create instability and to undermine our way of life and our freedoms, those should be investigated. Left-wing groups that are providing material support to that kind of violence should be investigated. I say, well, Chip, why just left-wing groups? Why not right-wing groups? Well, fine. Go look at any groups fomenting said violence. But all I know is in the wake of Charlie Kirk getting shot, I didn't see the streets around this country burning. I didn't see people's businesses and livelihoods getting looted and destroyed and burned from Minneapolis to California to our nation's capital. I didn't see statues getting toppled and tossed into water. I didn't see spray painting and destruction of public monuments and statues. What I saw was prayer. What I saw was people coming together in defense of their collective belief in God and their belief in this country, but willing to not just say, we need unity for the sake of it. I'm tired of that. I'm tired of this nonsense where we say, come together, we must unite. We need unity. Unity for what? Unity under what? Unity under a constitution, under a flag, and under God. Yes. In defense of a country with shared values? Yes. Not unity for the sake of it. Not turning the other cheek to a lawless bunch of organizations designed to take down and destroy our way of life in our country, to undermine our faith, undermine our country, undermine our freedoms. Because that's what we see. And you have to be blind to ignore it. And you have to be willful in that blindness, to ignore the conspiracy and the coordination to dismantle so much of what made this country great, to target institutions of faith, to target people for their conservative views and beliefs, to destabilize our society, to put criminals on the streets, to import people from around the world with criminal backgrounds and gang members for your own crass political purposes, to try to pack your districts and to try to expand your voter base. Well, it's not working, because this administration and those of us who have stood up to fight this and expose this are seeing to it that we're removing people from this country who should be removed, securing the border so that people aren't flooding across it, standing with law enforcement, securing our communities, backing the blue, restoring safety and security, not just at our nation's capital, but around the country, and making this country a place where you can achieve the American dream again, but only if we are willing to take on these organizations that are still causing the lawless to be walking among us that resulted directly in the death of a Ukrainian refugee who thought she could live the American dream, and it was taken away from her because people were purposely put on the street who are dangerous. There's no other way to look at that. That's literally what happened. I know that there's going to be a lot more conversations and speeches about Charlie coming up, but I'll just close with this. In a 1981 speech, which is hard to believe was almost 45 years ago, President Reagan declared, quote, "Liberal pro-criminal policies as rooted in utopian presumptions about human nature. For all our science and sophistication, for all our justified pride and intellectual accomplishment, we should never forget the jungle is always there waiting to take us over." He observed that the liberal belief that criminal justice is solely for rehabilitation instead of incapacitation and deterrence is rooted in a belief that there was nothing permanent or absolute about man's nature, and that by changing his environment, we could permanently change man and usher in a great new age. President Reagan was right. There is a place appropriately for forgiveness and rehabilitation, but there is not a place for allowing the rampant, lawless, and dangerous to be walking among our families and our communities, and our borders to be wide open, to endanger our societies for this crazy notion of some utopian nonsense, or worse yet, a purposeful use of this tool for political purposes. I applaud the president for doing what he's doing to try to secure our country. I call on my colleagues to band together to expose to the American people these organized efforts that are undermining our security and our way of life, targeted specifically at us. It is high time that we expose it. It is high time that we do something about it. And if we learned anything from what we saw unfold that resulted in the murder of Charlie, it is that we go find the people that are just as guilty as the young man that pulled that trigger. The people who are just as guilty because they created that environment, they fomented the radicalization and the creation of an environment where that occurred, knowingly destabilizing our society in the process. With that, Mr. Speaker, if my colleagues are ready, whoever's next.